Hello. I think I'm live. I think you can see me. Do I exist? Can I see the chat? I can see the chat. All right. If you are having trouble with blinking, in which case you might not be able to be seeing me talk very well, just click the pop-out stream button, and that should get rid of the refreshing problem. We will hopefully have a proper fix for that in as soon as possible. Thank you so much for your patience. Welcome to Roguelike Celebration 2020. It is a very special roguelike celebration this year, as you can see. This is our 5th roguelike celebration. Very exciting. It's been quite a lot of years now, and we're glad to continue it. And yeah, if this is your first time coming to Roguelike Celebration, very interesting one to join for the first time. But we hope you're going to have a great time. And if you've been here before, so good to see you again. I know all of us have been really excited to see the community and to see our friends here in this beautiful virtual space. And yeah, Roguelike Celebration, if you haven't been here before, or if you just want a reminder, is this community celebration of roguelikes and all things procedural. It's entirely run by volunteers, myself and several other people on the organizing team this year are kind of new volunteers who've been involved in speaking before and have kind of stepped up to help organize, which has been a very interesting year to become an organizer, let me tell you that. And we're really thankful to everyone being involved in making this year really special. We wanted to try and do our best to make this not just a, second best replacement for a physical conference like we would normally have, but something unique and new, and that also doesn't feel like just another Zoom meeting that you've probably been having a lot of in your life lately. So it's very exciting. We're really thankful to everyone's patience and their suggestions and ideas. This is very much a homemade experiment with this space. And really the hope was to capture, I remember when I came to Roguelike Celebration the first year in 2016, it meant so much to me because I had never been able to talk about roguelikes with anyone except my mother. And the first time I saw the altar and the black puddings and everything like that, it just meant so much to me to learn about that whole community. So I hope that you'll have time to explore this space and get some of that surprise and delight that I certainly felt the first time I came to a Roguelike Celebration. We also have more people than ever at Roguelike Celebration, and people from all around the world and who normally couldn't come to San Francisco, which I think is really fantastic. So if you're someone who was never able to come physically, welcome. It's so lovely to be able to have you. So this is our social space. Also, if you are watching this on Twitch or YouTube and are wondering what I'm talking about when I keep saying social space, go get a ticket from the Roguelike website. That is roguelike.club, I think. Yes, it's somewhere. Anyway, you can get a ticket all through the event, and that will get you into the social space, which is where we're doing our actual chat and speaker questions and things like that. This is a place you should think of as a real place. Even though you can't see faces, everyone that you're talking to is obviously a real person, so be kind, be polite, have fun with them, be considerate. We really love this community, and we want everyone to feel welcome and have a really good time. We also have a code of conduct. Very important. Hopefully you've read it already. If you haven't, make sure to take time to read it. It is on the sidebar, which is this way. One side of me includes a sidebar that has a code of conduct. Click on it, read it. One of the things it mentions is also that there are moderators in this space. You can message the moderators by typing /mod, and this will reach all of us and we'll get back to you. If you're not sure if something is worth talking to a mod, just talk to us anyway. We're always happy to hear. If you behave in a way that is violating our code of conduct, we can and will ban you from the conference. Please don't make us do this, but we can, and we will. So be polite, be considerate, have fun. Also in that sidebar, you can find the schedule. We have this beautiful social space that we've made along with the community, and we have lots of different things happening during the conference. We have talks, which you'll be able to watch here in the theater. We'll also have game showcases you can go play. We'll have unconferencing. We'll explain more when we get to it. And there's also little fun Easter eggs that some people have been discovering already, judging by how many people are holding strange food-like objects. So make sure to explore, enjoy the social time, and, if there's a talk and you are ending up having a really good conversation with someone, that's okay. The talks will be up later. Enjoy the space. Enjoy the socializing. Social space might have some hiccups. We've already seen 2 major ones. We got live. We could only test with like 5 people, so doing our best. Please bear with us. And if anything ever goes wrong, the Twitch and the YouTube links will always be up, so you can go watch that and not miss any of the talks. I know there's a lot of stuff I'm going through here. Bear with me. We also have amazing t-shirts designed by Tyreek Plummer, who's also a speaker. They're wonderful. You should get one. You can get a link to that at the swag table or through the website. And if you want to tweet about it, our hashtag is at the bottom there. It's hashtag roguelike celebration. Twitter lets us use more characters now, so we can use the full name of our conference. Wonderful. We also want to say thank you. We're going to have live captioning once again from Maggie at White Coat Captioning. Thankful to Maggie for all of her hard work through the weekend. Also thankful to Kristen, who made the beautiful overlays that you're seeing around, and when the stream was paused, they're really beautiful, and we're thankful for that. We're going to be moving into our first speaker soon. One thing that I will tell people about is that if you are in the theater, as you probably should be if you're seeing this, there is a button that is kind of hidden by how many people are in here, which is amazing, but it is there, and it is for speaker questions. This is a note wall. There's note walls in several places in the social space where you can kind of put up a post-it on the wall. Other people can come along and read it, and they can also upvote it. If you have any questions for speakers while they're talking, you can put them on the note wall, and I'll be able to see them. You can also upvote if there are questions there that you particularly want to see the answer to or hear the speaker address. So use that. Please don't put your questions just in chat because it can move pretty quickly, and the likelihood that I'll miss it is quite high. So put it in the note wall, upvote what you want, and I'll be basically clearing that speaker wall in between the speakers. That is all of our big, long-winded administrative details. So I can basically either fill some time or we can get into the next speaker early. I hope everyone is having a good day. I think that if we start early, there will be more time for questions. So perfect. All right. I would like to introduce Lisa Brown, who is our first speaker today. She's a game designer in the industry for over a decade, working both in AAA at Insomniac and Bungie, and as an indie on games like Hyper Light Drifter. Very exciting. She loves gameplay systems and mentoring mid-career game designers, which means I should talk to you later. But welcome so much, Lisa. It is fantastic to have you, and we'll be playing a video and having time for questions after, so take it away. Oh, we are missing audio from this video. Uh-oh. This is our first technical problem of the conference. It's not. It's our third technical problem of the conference. Womp womp. All right. I'm going to keep talking. This is why I'm here, to fill the technical dead time with mindless babble. Let's try that again. Drum roll. It's going to work this time, guys and gals and folks who know better to pick one.
Friends, welcome to Roguelike Celebration, and thank you for coming to my talk, Why Do I Even Like Roguelikes? An Exploration of Player Motivation. My name is Lisa Brown, and I am a game designer. I have worked on many a game in my career, mostly action combat games, and I've played many a game in my life. I love all different sorts of games. Roguelikes, however, are a special love of mine, and something I would consider a pretty recent love at that. In fact, I remember the first time I even heard the phrase roguelike. I'd always loved games, and I was a fledgling game designer at the time, so I was curious to learn more. So I asked around about what is this roguelike? What does that mean? And several different folks explained it to me in very similar ways. Here's what they said. They all said that a roguelike was a game that was really hard, where you failed all the time. One where you explored procedural and random dungeons.
Oh, it's me again. Your friendly MC. We're figuring this out for the first time. You might have noticed it's super quiet. We're going to try and start again. This is why we get to start early. It's great. We're going to get another chance at it. Take 3, but louder. More hype.
Greetings, friends. Welcome to Roguelike Celebration, and thank you for coming to my talk, Why Do I Even Like Roguelikes? An Exploration of Player Motivation. My name is Lisa Brown, and I'm a game designer. I have worked on many a game in my career, mostly action combat games, and I've played many a game in my life. I love all different sorts of games. Roguelikes, however, are a special love of mine, and something I would consider a pretty recent love at that. In fact, I remember the first time I even heard the phrase roguelike. I'd always loved games, and I was a fledgling game designer at the time, so I was curious to learn more. So I asked around about what is this roguelike? What does that mean? And several of the different folks explained it to me in very similar ways. Here's what they said. They all said that a roguelike was a game that was really hard, where you failed all the time, one where you explored procedural and random dungeons, and most importantly, that there was permadeath. So if you died, you lost all your progress and had to start all over. And I remember listening to this at the time and thinking, wow, that sounds terrible. This definitely does not sound like a game for me. And so I wrote off roguelikes for years as something I just probably wouldn't like. I didn't try any. But fast forward to now, and it turns out I really, really like roguelikes. In fact, they're one of my favorite type of game. These three in particular, Nuclear Throne, Slay the Spire, and Loot Rascals, are three of my favorites. And they were the ones that got me, right? I put many hours into them. They kept me way up past my bedtime with just one more run type of situation. And I love them a lot. So why did this dissonance happen? Why was there this opposite reaction when these games were described to me? And that's the goal of this talk. I want to answer several questions. First of all, why do I like roguelikes if I was so put off by the description of them? And why are they so sticky for me? Like, it's not just that I enjoy them. There are ones that just they really grab me. Second, why do I like some roguelikes but not others? Why, for example, do I have hundreds of hours put into Nuclear Throne, but Enter the Gungeon just sort of bounced off of me? And then number three, is there a way I could have described these games better to help past Lisa get a better understanding of the gameplay experience? Basically, this is all a very introspective journey on the player motivations of me specifically, but hopefully you'll all learn something along the way as well. So a while back on Twitter, I went and I asked roguelike players to tell me how they describe a roguelike to someone who had never heard the term before, so past Lisa essentially. And I encourage them to describe it in their own words. But I got a lot of similar things as those original descriptions. Run-based, having to try again and again. Randomness, procedural generation came up a lot. Permadeath, or only having one chance. Some people mentioned a limited carryover progression. And exploring the unknown came up a lot. And here's the thing. These descriptions of roguelikes were focusing on the mechanics and the features of the games themselves. But that wasn't enough for past Lisa. There was a dissonance there. So for this exploration, instead, I'm going to be looking at players. I want to understand the motivations of the players who like roguelikes and see if there's something there that explains to me why I love these games so much. So let's talk about player motivation models real quick. I'm a professional game designer, so this is something that comes up in my industry. These are basically ways of thinking about why players play games and what motivations are they fulfilling when they play games. There's lots of different models, but today I'm going to focus on the Quantic Foundry gamer motivation model. I like this. It's very science-backed, and it's not perfect, but it does do a pretty good job of defining player motivations. So they break down the motivations into 6 primary, so action, social, mastery, achievement, immersion, and creativity. And then there's 2 secondary motivations for each one. So for example, if you have a high social score, then those players are motivated by playing with other humans. And maybe they have a particularly high community score. They might prefer more cooperative games or games with a robust clan system. And for them, that's a big reason why they even play games. So I took their survey. It's a self-directed survey. It's a lot like if you've ever taken a Big Five or Ocean personality profile, it's set up in a similar way. You answer all these questions about your preferences and you give them examples of games you like and so on. And here's my scores. So these are percentiles, basically. It's a percentile rank across the motivations. And that means these are basically how strong your motivations are relative to other gamers. But one thing I don't really like about how this is displayed is if you look at this, what would you think my most extreme scores are? At a glance, I would probably think, oh, action's pretty high, excitement, challenge and completion are up there. But in truth, my most extreme scores are the ones that are really low: immersion, creativity, story, power, and strategy. And the reason is that these scores, this is a spectrum. If you have a low score in something, it doesn't mean you lack that thing. It just means that a different end of the spectrum motivates you. So I redid my visualization here like this to show how they fall on a spectrum. So basically, if you're in the middle, it's like, oh yeah, take it or leave it. I could go one way or the other. The further you are to either end, the stronger your opinion is. If you're 100 action, then if that game is not like pumping adrenaline right into your veins, then you're not interested. But if you're 0 action, then like any amount of stress in the game and you're not interested. So very extreme scores. So when I was looking at these scores, I had a hypothesis, which was that the action, mastery, and achievement motivations would probably be most relevant to my love of roguelikes. I'm going to skip talking about social because that's more to do with multiplayer. And I'll go into those low scoring motivations later in the talk, but I'm going to start with these 3: action, mastery, and achievement, and see what we can see. So first up is action with its sub or secondary motivations, excitement and destruction. So I have a slightly high action score, which means I like jumping into the fray and being surrounded by drama, but I also appreciate calmer and slower paced games. I just have a slight preference for the more dramatic stuff. My excitement score is pretty high, meaning I like fast paced games, intensity, and have a desire to be surprised. And destruction's pretty in the middle, which means I'm neutral on chaos. I appreciate a well-done explosion, but I can take it or leave it. It's not a huge factor in deciding what games I want to play. And this all tracks really well with Nuclear Throne, of course, because Nuclear Throne is a high-action, twitch thumb skill game, lots of guns and explosions and screen shake. So this makes sense here. But what about these two? Slay the Spire and Loot Rascals are not action games. They're turn-based games. But even though they're not pure action, I found that these games still have qualities that appeal to this action motivation. In particular, these things. Drama, a fast pace, like a fast failure loop, a feeling of intensity, and an opportunity to improvise, to be surprised. For drama, what I mean is, in these games, the stakes are really against you. Lethality is really high. There's no freebies. Any enemy can be dangerous, even the humble maggot. And you often feel overwhelmed and like you have to be on your toes. And that's very satisfying to me. For pacing, I find these games have really fast failure loops, which means the speed at which you get back into the game after a failure is very fast. And slower failure loops make a game less sticky for me. I think this is one of the reasons Enter the Gungeon didn't stick for me. So if you compare the time it takes from when you die to get back into the action, here's Nuclear Throne. And you're in. That's like 5 seconds, I would say. Enter the Gungeon, however, has a lot longer performance at death. So not counting loading time, that's at least over 10 seconds. And that for me makes the game less sticky. I need that fast loop. And this isn't limited to roguelikes for me. This is why I love games like Celeste, where when I fail, I have just enough time to register what I did wrong, what I could have done differently, and then boom, I'm right back in the action. That's what I mean by a fast failure loop. For intensity, the thing these games do well is the intensity of seeing the outcome of your decisions. In Nuclear Throne, this comes through the fact that it's an action game and you're always seeing the results of the decisions you make. But for something like Slay the Spire, this comes through that moment when the enemy intent pops up and I see my hand and I register whether or not I'm in trouble. And in Loot Rascals, it's watching the maths of combat play out and hoping that I made the right gamble engaging with an enemy. A lot of this, again, has to do with performance. In the original Rogue, which I did not really care for, I think it's because there's not enough intensity for me in watching the outcome of things. So when you're in combat, you have like a text description of what's going on, but you sort of have to like pay attention to your health to really understand like what's happening and how in trouble you are. And it doesn't register as quickly for me. So I think that's why this game bounced for me. And lastly, there's improvisation and a desire to be surprised. This is where the procedural features of roguelikes and the randomness can fulfill this desire, even if there aren't action games. And I basically want to improvise and react to the current situation. So, like in Slay the Spire, if I get a relic in the middle of my run that could make me rethink my entire build, that's a satisfying experience for me. So let's add these action motivations to an ongoing list of Lisa's roguelike motivation list. Drama, where the stakes are not in your favor. A fast pace, the failure loops are very fast. An intensity in the performance of seeing the outcome of your decisions. And a desire to be surprised and improvise and react to the situation at hand. So next up is the mastery motivation, and its secondaries, challenge and strategy. When I read the description of these motivations, I felt like they were very in tune with roguelikes because it's all about challenge and progression. But digging into my own results yielded a couple of surprises. My mastery low motivation is like middle low, which means I prefer being able to be spontaneous in games, but I don't mind some depth and complexity. My challenge score is just slightly above the middle, meaning I like a mix in my games of overcoming skill-based learning curves, but also quick-to-learn, straightforward mechanics. And I have an extremely low strategy score, which means I like reactive gameplay, I like short time horizons, and low cognitive load. And these three things in particular are key with the roguelikes I love: reactive decision-making, challenge that serves a purpose, and short time horizons. So with reactive decisions, this is my way of looking at how that desire for spontaneity and also the desire for depth of mastery mix together. I prefer roguelikes that give me a small number of meaningful decisions to make on a regular basis. So in Nuclear Throne, this is when I've leveled up, I beat a level, and I get to choose between one of the mutations. In Slay the Spire, it's me choosing my card at the end of combat. And in Loot Rascals, it's choosing and fiddling with the layout of my attack and defense cards every time I get a new drop. This is just enough to make me feel like I'm improvising and reacting to the current situation and making strategic choices without a lot of cognitive load. Games like FTL bounced off of me because they have a much higher cognitive load, and I can't keep up with that because my strategy score is so low. So even though these are great games, this is the reason they didn't stick for me. My middling challenge score means I appreciate challenge, but only if it serves my goals. I don't like difficulty for difficulty's sake, but I'm happy to put in the work to master a challenge if it brings me closer to my goal. For example, in Slay the Spire, I had zero interest in doing Ascensions once I learned you don't get any benefit out of them. They're just harder. I only ever did Ascension 1 because you get more elites, which means you get more helpful relics. But I don't feel like I'm missing out by not trying to get to Ascension 20. That just doesn't fulfill my motivations. For short time horizons, this comes from my low strategy score, and it's pretty key in distinguishing between roguelikes that I love and roguelikes that I don't. A short time horizon means I don't have to wait too long to see the results of my decisions, and it means I can understand the end goal easily so I can judge my progress along it. With a lower cognitive load, I don't want to hold too much in my brain at once. A long time horizon, an example of that would be like 4X grand strategy games like Europa Universalis or the Crusader Kings series, games where the results of your decisions take a long time to cook and play out. So if you have a high strategy score, you probably like these games. But I can't. For me, my score is so low, I can't even play a 4X game. It's so intense. And the roguelikes I love, the time horizons are ultra short and clearly visible. When you die in Nuclear Throne, you see exactly where you are along the track, how close you got to the throne. In Slay the Spire, they lay out the tracks very clearly for you, so you know how far you have to get, and you can judge how close you are to the goal. In Loot Rascals, you know, there's 5 sections, so when you beat one, it's very clear how far you are, how far you have to go. And I use this as a basis for making decisions. I think this is a factor why games like Into the Breach bounced for me. They have slightly longer time horizons. It's not a ton, but in Into the Breach, you do have to think several moves ahead. And even though that's not much longer, again, my strategy score is so low that anything requiring me to hold too much of my brain just bounces for me. All right, so let's add those to our list. I like reactive decision making, meaningful decisions between a small number of choices on a regular basis. I like challenge only if it serves my goals. I don't care for difficulty's sake. And I need short time horizons, a low time between making meaningful decisions and seeing the results. Next on our list is the achievement motivation and its secondaries, completion and power. I have a lowish achievement score, meaning I have a pretty relaxed attitude towards in game achievements. I care about some of them, but not all of them. I like to check boxes, but only the boxes I care about. Meanwhile, I have a higher completion score, which means I'm task oriented. I love completing tasks and doing quests and stuff like that. My power score surprised me because it's very low. And it surprised me because power is all about progression and getting stronger, like starting weak, getting stronger, which sounds pretty integral to a roguelike. So I was surprised this was so low. Low power scores prefer a flat progression, a level playing field. And the more I thought about it, though, I think it just means that it's my desire for completion that drives me to gain power. I don't get implicit joy just from the act of leveling up. And this tracks with other games too. It reminds me of my World of Warcraft days, where when I would hit the level cap, I wouldn't even realize it because I was just so focused on completing quests. Meanwhile, I had a friend who had like calculated the most efficient way to gain XP and was off killing boars or something for like a week straight just to hit the cap. So my motivation wasn't to gain power, it was to complete those tasks. And I think this holds true in roguelikes. So, for example, in Loot Rascals, you have these chef quests, and getting them gives you like more powerful upgrades. But for me, it's like how those upgrades will help me achieve the goal, and just the fact that I love doing quests. That's why I'm motivated to do them. I think these can be summarized in just a high satisfaction with short runs is really motivated by those achievement scores. Um, Basically, I care about achievement in terms of what the task at hand in, which is the run. And I don't really care about losing power because my power score is really low, which means failure doesn't really sting. I don't feel like, oh, I was so close to the perfect build and I lost it all. I'm able to redirect my focus to, okay, a new clean slate, a new task to do. And that like motivates me to keep going. And I think for me, this means roguelikes with shorter runs feel better, even if that means you're dying a lot. I think the game, The Story Goes On, has a really interesting way of satisfying this motivation for me. In your first run in this game, you don't really die that often. But whenever you loop, they take away a bunch of your upgrades. You get and a bunch of your stats. You get to keep some of them, but they remove a bunch of them. And this is interesting because it means you get a frequent power reset. It's just not due to death. So let's add that onto the list. The achievement motivation makes me desire these short and frequent runs. I have a visceral satisfaction with frequent clean slates and new tasks at hand. So now I want to look at my extreme scores. While I do feel like action, mastery, and achievement definitely are the most aligned with roguelikes, my immersion and creativity scores seem to be big factors in why I prefer some over others. So let's take a closer look, starting with immersion and its two secondary motivations, fantasy and story. So my immersion score is extremely low, which surprised me because I do like narrative games and whatnot. But when it comes to roguelikes, I'm way more grounded in the mechanics of the game. That's what's driving it for me. For fantasy, I appreciate world building as a rapper, but I'm not looking to lose myself in becoming someone else when I play a roguelike. When I play Slay the Spire, I don't care about the Ironclad as a character. That's just like a placeholder to ground me into the mechanics. And for story, overarching narrative and characters are not really a factor in if I enjoy a roguelike. And occasionally it can be a distraction. So, for example, Road Not Taken is an interesting one. Now, these scores might make it sound like I hate story and I don't care about characters. But again, this is more to do with what motivates me to keep playing the game. And in Road Not Taken, which is an amazing game, this is a game from Spry Fox. It's basically what if Triple Town were a roguelike, but it has a really strong immersive wrapper. The whole game is a metaphor for the creator's struggle with his decision to not have children, and it comes through really strongly in the characters, the quests, the world. And so I felt really emotionally attached to my character and emotionally invested in their motivations. So the problem was that the first time I died, I was done. Like, I never played this game again because it was emotionally traumatizing for me. So this bounced hard for me, but if you have really high immersion scores, you might want to check this game out because it might really click for you. All right, so narrative for me as a rapper only, I'm way more grounded in the mechanics. So the last one I'm going to look at today is creativity with design and discovery. So this is probably my most extreme score. My creativity score is extremely low. And again, this doesn't mean that I'm not creative. It means in the games I enjoy, I don't really have a need to experiment within the game world. I accept the world as it is. I have an extremely low design score, which means I prefer a curated experience. I don't really care about customization or expressing my individuality through the game. So when I make builds in a roguelike, it's not because I'm trying to express who I am as a person. I'm doing it to achieve my goals. And so it needs to be simple. And then, interestingly, I have a low discovery score. This means that I prefer fully exposed rule sets in my games. I want minimum unknown variables. I want to understand the game space so I can learn how to operate within it. And my hypothesis on why all these scores are so low is that I'm a game designer professionally, so I do all this stuff in my job, like every day. I do these things for a living. So basically, I don't want these in my games because it makes my games feel like work. At least that's my theory. So, to summarize how this manifests in my preferences, I can say that I want exposed rule sets. I want simple, practical builds that are not expressive. And exploration for me feels like work. My extreme desire for exposed rule sets is probably why games like Slay the Spire and Loot Rascals are so sticky for me. Things like showing enemy intent, the exact health and damage amounts, and in Loot Rascals, they very explicitly explain the maths behind combat. Like, randomness is fine as long as it's part of a rule set that I can grok up front. And when I make a build in a roguelike, it's because I'm improvising, reacting to the circumstances, and making choices that are going to help me reach my goal. I'm not really interested in expressing who I am through a build, and I need them to be simple. One of the reasons that I bounced off of Rogue Legacy was at the end of a run, before you start a new one, you have to make these decisions in this skill tree up front. And it was very distracting for me. And you might be thinking, Lisa, this is not a complicated skill tree. It's got like 4 layers to it. What's the big deal? But you have to understand that this is an extreme score for me. So anything more that I can hold in my head and I bounce, I need 4 things to choose from. And I want to see the strategic impact of my decisions immediately. Anything more, and I get tired. And lastly, exploration is work to me. I don't want to be bothered discovering the unknown. It's tiring and distracting. It doesn't fulfill me. And I think this is one of the big reasons that I didn't enjoy the original Rogue. Rogue is very heavy on exploration. You get these potions and scrolls, you don't know what they do, you have to figure it out. When you encounter an enemy, you don't really know what it's capable of or what you're up against. You just have to figure it out through the combat. And these are the things that made it bounce really hard for me. But if you have a high discovery score and you've never played the original Rogue, you should give it a try because it might be for you. All right, so I want exposed rule sets. I need to understand the bounds I'm working within. Simple, practical builds, small number of choices, not expressive. And exploration for me is work. I can't be bothered with discovering the unknown. So we did it. We looked at all those scores and dove into my player motivations. And this is how it affects my enjoyment of roguelikes. I like games that have drama, intensity, a fast pace where I have an opportunity to improvise, but within a known rule set that's laid out clearly for me. I prefer making reactive decisions, and I like challenge as long as it serves my goals. My runs need to be short and frequent, and while narrative is great as a wrapper, it can't distract me from the mechanics. I need those time horizons to be short. I need to see the impact of my decisions right away, and I have no aversion to starting over with a clean slate. So maybe, if I had had roguelikes explained to me on these terms, I might have clicked with it a lot easier. Who can say? And so what's the point of all this? Don't get me wrong, I would love it if we could start tagging games by the player motivations they serve, but I don't expect that to happen. Player motivation models are nerdy game designer stuff, and probably a bit much to expect the general game playing audience to adopt. But what it can do is this self-analysis can help me ask the right questions to figure out if a roguelike is going to click with me or not. So on that note, let's end with an experiment. Let's talk about Hades. I've not played Hades yet. Seems really good. My friends love it. It's got rave reviews. But will it stick with me? Will I play it so much that it becomes a problem? And that's where I will ask you, people who have played Hades, to think about the following questions. How short are the time horizons? How fast is the failure loop? How fast is the time between decisions? Is the story and fantasy a contextual wrapper, or will it get in my way? Does it have intense outcome resolutions? Is exploration low? Are there a minimum amount of unknown variables? And I've set up a survey that you can take. I'll put the link in the chat. And you can give me your analysis of Hades on these fronts. And after I get a good number of responses, I'll play the game and I'll see if the experience lines up with those outcomes. So with that, I want to thank you for coming to my talk. I will have a link to the slides available for people to check these out. You can follow me on Twitter at Wordle if you're interested in the result of the Hades experiment. And if you want to do a self-deep dive of your own, please be sure to check out the Gamer Motivation Profile survey on Quantic Foundry's site and look at some of the talks they've given on the topic, because it is a fascinating subject. Again, thank you and enjoy the rest of Roguelike Celebration.
All right. Fantastic talk, Lisa.
We did it.
We did
it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know you've been in the chat and see how much people are enjoying it. That final point about Hades is fantastic.
Yeah, please do take out that survey. I really want the data. I want to see what turns out.
Yeah, I heard there's romance and you can pet a dog, which is all I need to be sold. So taking a look at the speaker questions, the top rated one is actually asking if you'd like to introduce yourself a little bit.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm Lisa. I'm a game designer. I like bird watching and I have a cat. What do you want to know?
Show us the cat.
No, I've been a game designer for over 10 years. In all spaces, I've done AAA stuff, indie stuff, academic stuff. So yeah, I'm a big fan of deep dive player psychology stuff like this in my work. And I'd always wanted to just dig in and do a self-introspection thing, which I think would be great if other people who have really different scores for me could just do this talk only with their scores. I'd love to see what comes up.
Yeah. I mean, it would be fantastic. We have like unconferencing sessions if anyone wants to take an unconference session to discuss their player motivations.
Yeah,
I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Mhm.
Another question. So when you took this quiz, were you thinking about the questions in terms of roguelikes only, or were you trying to think about all games that you enjoy?
For this specifically, I was thinking about roguelikes because I do feel like different games serve different motivations, and I was really wanting to dig into specifically roguelikes. So, for example, like I'm playing Spiritfarer right now, and I love it, and that is definitely like a low action game. Not a lot of, it's very different, very heavy on narrative. So it's just very different motivations it serves.
Yeah.
So definitely was trying to focus. I think that's one of the flaws of this model is it can be very broad. So I find it helpful to sort of have a game in mind or a set of games in mind when taking it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've used Quantic Foundry before, and I never thought about specializing in like that. That's really cool. I know there's a question on the board of can we take the quiz ourselves?
Yes.
Yes.
I put a link in the chat. I'll put it again just in case because I know the chat scrolls fast.
Yes. Also, we will try, I think, to for tomorrow, if nothing else, or at least like put that link on a note wall somewhere, like the @ sign.
Oh, yeah,
like,
yeah.
We'll try and stick it up somewhere where people can find it, and probably tweet it and some things like that.
Cool.
But yes, another question here: what roguelikes would you say is highly expressive that fulfills the opposite of the practical builds idea? A good question from Hyper Gardens.
I have no idea because I wouldn't have enjoyed it, so I wouldn't have played it. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's got to be out there, right? I feel like the expressiveness and the exploration like tend to like go well together because there's so much of like you digging in. Kawa says things like NetHack might be good for that.
Yeah,
so, maybe.
Cut is an interesting point as well to me, just in that I know that like I replaced my legs with treads, and it wasn't because I thought that was the best build. It's because
I'm gonna have tank legs.
Yeah. I can have tank legs.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a good try NetHack.
Always trying to hack. People do want to see the cat if the cat is available.
Cat is asleep right now. I'm sorry, but I can like pull a picture up on my phone and like show it.
One other real question, not that there's not a real question, also from Hyper Gardens. If you've played DCSS, Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, how would you rate it for you on the motivation?
I have not played it. Okay. I have not. Someone, you tell me. Would I like it? Here's my cat.
Oh.
Here's my cat.
Yay!
This is a terrible way to like show a picture of a cat within a webcam. But I don't know. Like that's sort of why I'm interested in this. Is would I like it? I don't know. You tell me. Because I haven't played it, and it's always like that. Whenever I start a roguelike, I'm like, oh, is this going to be one of those? Is this going to be one that I'm gonna like? It's going to eat my life for the next 6 months, or is this going to be one that I play and think is interesting and move on?
Yeah,
I never know.
DCSS to me is interesting. I'd be curious just in that I think there's a lot of variability where I've sometimes played as like an octopus or a cat because that's fun, and the expressiveness, but also I then find it fulfilling. I play a Minotaur fighter over and over and over again until I can get that orb. So it's interesting that some games have room inside of it. I feel like you can play DCSS as someone who wants expressiveness and play it as someone who wants
people are saying they suspect I wouldn't like it, so
well, you can't like all of them.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Any other burning questions? We have like 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Get the questions up there, folks.
Yeah. But in the meantime, I think what I really want to point out with this talk is like there's nothing wrong with these games because I don't like them. They just don't fit. They don't serve me. And I think we can get lost in that sometimes, being like, oh, this is a good game, this is a bad game. Oh, like, you have to play this to understand what these games are all about. But there's so many different reasons that people play games that, it's more about the player than the game. And that's why, like, even really great games that I know are well designed and critically acclaimed, like FTL or Into the Breach, I just don't like them. And that's nothing wrong with the game. It's just they're serving a different motivation, which is fine because there's plenty of players with that motivation that need to be served.
I think that's a beautiful point. And that's a beautiful point to make at the beginning of this roguelike celebration. That's one of the things that's always defined us is that we're not going to get hardcore into, you know, what is a roguelike, what isn't. Like, we're not being exclusive about it because there are so many games that fulfill different niches, and the roguelike genre can make so many people happy. So wonderful final point. Thank you so much, Lisa. Hopefully people can find you in the space as Wordle, I believe is your username, and ask you more questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. All right. Excellent. New speaker. Hello.
Hello.
All right. Do you want me to introduce you? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Go for it, and I'll pick up from there.
All right. This is Tabitha Sable. She's been a hacker and cross-platform sysadmin since the turn of the century. Her first exposure to Rogue was under OpenBSD Max 68K 2.3 on the trusty Quadra 800, which are just words to me, which soon led to commissioning a 386 server and offering shell and game services to her fellow students, which is very impressive. Today, she can usually be found teaching adversarial techniques to other engineers, sharing systems engineering viewpoints with security folks, bicycling, and saying, I wonder what happens if we... And yeah, you're here to talk to us about curses, which is very exciting.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So, like...
take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, like, hey, good morning. You know, like she said, I'm Tabitha Sable, and I got exposed to Rogue and Roguelike in around the same way that I got exposed to a lot of these other things, to information security concepts and to like being a sysadmin and running servers for people, all sort of at the same time, because it was just a really good situation at school. And so I was playing with Rogue around the same time that I was learning a lot of these professional things. And so to me, like, thinking about Rogue ends up being tied into this whole story of the evolution of Unix and the evolution of the software that was needed to support being able to use Unix and the applications that you run on it, like games. So that's what I'm here to share with you this morning. One of my favorite things, a story of why things are how they are, or how the path that we took influenced where we ended up. And so along the way, we end up hitting some fun questions like, why did Bell Labs give us the ed editor while Berkeley gave us VI? Why doesn't Adventure, like the Colossal Cave Adventure, repeat the room description on subsequent times that you enter the room? If you are used to using a graphical interface on Linux or BSD or commercial Unix machine, you've used X Windows. Why is it called X Windows? And, you know, where did Rogue get its great graphics from? You know, all of these kinds of questions are tied up in that story of what the hardware and software that we interface with Unix looked like. So in that story, there are three major eras. There's the earliest time of paper teletypes, research Unix from Bell Labs, and then moves into a middle period of glass teletypes or video display terminals, or the term of art at the time was dumb terminals, and BSD Unix. And then after we pass through that time, we move into workstations with bitmap displays, the so-called Unix wars with a lot of different commercial vendors selling Unix-based operating systems, and the starting of modern open source. So we'll begin at the beginning with paper teletypes and research Unix, you know, from the late 60s into the mid 70s. But the story actually starts way, way, way before then, like in the early and then moving into late 1800s. So, you know, in the 1800s, the telegraph was invented. And of course, to use a telegraph, you had to learn Morse code. That requires a lot of skill. And so, you know, it was a limiting factor for, you know, how many telegraph lines you could run. So you had to have skilled telegraph operators. So there was a desire to reduce that amount of skill that you needed. And that desire led to the creation of a lot of teleprinters. And you see an example of a very, very early one here with this piano-like keyboard, and not super practical, but slightly easier to use than learning Morse code. By the turn of the century, these had evolved into much more practical machines, like this Morcom printing telegraph that you see here from 1908, where it's essentially a electric typewriter connected to a telegraph line or a serial link or some other thing like that, with another one on the other side. So you type on the keyboard here and it encodes the data, shoots it down the wire, and makes the printer move on the other side, and vice versa. And so this was much easier to learn, much easier to find people to do, and let news move across the country in the United States and around the world in a much faster and easier way. So the Baudot code, like a 5-bit binary code, got settled on pretty early as the standard that these teletypes would communicate with each other over. And incidentally, that's why your serial port speed, your modem speed, get called baud rate today. So we're done with the turn of the century. We're going to flash forward into the early to mid 60s. And the computing industry is in the beginning of this shift from batch-oriented machines that use card punches for input into shared multi-user interactive systems. So MIT, General Electric, and Bell Labs were working together on a project called Multics, which envisioned the computer as a utility. You know, like premonitions of the cloud here, right? So there'd be a big computer in a central office somewhere, and if you had programs you needed to run, you could run them on this big computer that you could subscribe to, and then everything would be great. So this system had to be very robust because it had to be everything to everybody. So the Multics operating system was originally designed to run on a huge mainframe system from GE, the 645. It had about 2.25 megabytes of RAM, which was a tremendous amount of RAM in the mid-1960s. The teletype was kind of an obvious choice for interfacing with one of these interactive time-sharing computers. And the Bell system owned the Teletype Corporation since 1930. So the folks at Bell Labs who were working on Multics had Teletype TTY37 terminals, which were really fancy teletypes. They had upper and lower case. So now, 1969, it's the beginning of Unix. We see here is a later picture of PDP-11, like what Unix kind of blossomed onto in the early 70s at AT&T and Bell Labs. So in 1969, Bell pulled out of the Multics project, and management wouldn't let any engineers buy a large computer because they were afraid that the people who had been working on Multics were disappointed, and if they had a big computer, they would just start building something like Multics again. And some of these folks here, we see Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. They wanted a nice system to use, like they had gotten used to, but they couldn't buy a computer. They tried a few times and kept getting denied. But they found in Department 13, local area switching, a disused PDP-7. This was a tiny, tiny, tiny computer. It had 9 kilobytes of RAM. Compare that to the 2.25 megabytes that the GE machine from Multics had. But it was there, and it was a computer, and it was free at a time when even a tiny computer was wicked expensive. So they took it and they wrote a tiny little time-sharing operating system for it. Eventually, they proved that it was practical, and they bought a bigger tiny computer. They got a PDP-11 with 24 kilobytes of core memory. And that one was big enough that Unix could be really useful in self-hosting on it. And of course, they kept their TTY37s that they had from Multics. At this time, login to a Unix system was by a local serial connection or dial-up modem only. And the device nodes, because in Unix, everything is a file, the device nodes were named /dev/TTY and a number, because it was which number teletype it was. And so, like, if you have worked with any Linux commands that deal with sending serial data through devices, you may have occasionally received the error message, not a typewriter. And this is why, because the TTY device that you were running your data through had a control issue to it that only made sense if it was really a TTY. And these names still show up on the names of serial ports on a modern Linux system today. Terminal handling was complicated from the beginning. I just absolutely love this quote, IOCTL is a closet full of skeletons. So IOCTL was originally designed in Unix as a system call for configuring the IO properties, the input-output properties of a teletype. So in the very first Unix manual from 1971, there's a place where it says, Unix has a heavy predisposition towards Model 37 teletype terminals. And the init program, which managed logins on all the terminals, did magic automatic detection between a TTY37 and a GE Terminet 300, which was a different terminal. It was a little more inexpensive. Next year, they added support for another terminal, and the STTY command appeared in the manual. And that was to tune the settings of your TTY. And even in 1972, the manual said, this call should be used with care. It is all too easy to turn off your typewriter. By the 6th edition Unix in 1975, STTY started to really acknowledge that this was a huge complexity problem by including packages, so that instead of specifying all of the different settings like the baud rate and the number of bits per word and so on, if you had a popular terminal, you could just apply the package. And so even in these early days with teletypes, there's a lot of complexity in this software. So now we've made it into sort of the middle period of video display terminals and BSD Unix. Video display terminals were unimpressive at first, but they improved really rapidly. This is a picture of a DataPoint 3300. It was the very first video display terminal. It came out in 1969. They were wicked expensive. They didn't actually support as many fancy features as the high-end teletypes, but it was quiet, it was self-contained, it didn't take up a lot of space, and paved the way for what was going to come forward. So by the time we get to the late 70s, here is a Digital Equipment Corporation VT100, which was sort of the de facto standard terminal. It was like the terminal that everybody else wanted to be. By the time we get to the late 70s here, you had a machine that had a lot of features. It could do upper and lower case, blank the whole screen, move the cursor around, a lot of fancy things. And this particular terminal also is the one that introduced today's standard of 80 by 24 characters. So in almost every terminal emulator today, when you first open it up, the most basic default is 80 by 24. This is why, this VT100. And that evolution continued, so that by the early 80s, here is a VT220, which took over for the VT100 as being the most popular terminal in the world, and it was smaller, cheaper, and fancier. So two things were happening in this era. First off, Bell Labs was slow to give up their paper teletypes. They got, in the mid-70s, some Tektronix 4014 storage tube terminals, like you see in this picture, but they were very slow to redraw. It's not a bitmap display on here. It's not a character cell display. It's a vector display. And so it's got a storage tube. It's vector drawing. And so you would send it commands like draw a line from this coordinate to that coordinate. It had a character cell mode, but the character cell mode was implemented by logic inside the terminal that would have to use the vector drawing commands internally to draw, each one of the little letters. And because it's a storage display tube, you have to erase the whole screen at once. So it's not paper, but it's very slow and clunky and not really suited to the kind of interactive use that we would see later. On the other hand, the University of California, Berkeley was really quick to adopt glass TTYs. So what you see here is an ADM3 dumb terminal, which was especially famous for being the first video display terminal that cost less than $1,000 US. These are what were installed in a lot of the computer labs at the University of California, Berkeley, around the time when the Berkeley software distribution Unix starting up. If you look really carefully at that picture, you can see there's no arrow keys on the keyboard, but the letters H, J, K, and L have arrows printed on them. And this is why, to this day, those are the letters that you use to move around in VI. So these enhanced capabilities, like being able to do colors on some fancy terminals, bold, underline, flashing, clear the screen, move the cursor around, and the greater diversity. I only talked about the DEC terminals because they were the most popular, but there were many, many manufacturers, and Oftentimes, they were mutually incompatible with each other. These capabilities and diversity required more complicated software to manage it. And that's where we get into the story of the VI editor, the curses library, and eventually Rogue. So Ed is the canonical Unix editor. It's a line-oriented editor. It's designed to be used on a paper teletype. And honestly, I think it's really well designed. It is the easiest to use editor that I can imagine if your input to the computer is a keyboard and the output is a typewriter. But it's notoriously hard to use. I'll share with you one of my favorite entries from the Unix fortune cookie program. Ken Thompson has an automobile which he helped design. Unlike most automobiles, it has neither speedometer, nor gas gauge, nor any of the other numerous lights which plague the modern driver. Rather, if the driver makes a mistake, a giant question mark lights up in the center of the dashboard. The experienced driver, says Thompson, will usually know what's wrong. So, in the mid-70s, 1976, George Corluda wrote M, the editor for mortals, based on Ed, with additional features to make it more user-friendly. He came and was either visiting or a student, I don't recall at the moment, at UC Berkeley, and showed it to Bill Joy and friends, and they picked that up and ran with it. So as they improved it, they started incrementing the name. EM, EN. The historical record has lost how many different name versions they went to, but eventually they did get EX. So in 1978, the first Berkeley software distribution add-on for Unix shipped with X and the library called TermCap that powered it. So one of the most popular features of X was visual mode. You could type visual into the command line, and then instead of doing this like paper teletype inspired line-oriented editing where you had to remember what your file looked like and you could only see the exact bit you were working on, instead, if you had a nice glass TTY, it would take over the whole screen and show you what you were working on as you were working on it, which was, very new and revolutionary at the time. So in order to support that, there was some code in there for redrawing the screen. And rather than having the various idiosyncrasies of the supported terminal types hard-coded into the X source code, it was put out into a file, like a database file. And this is what it looked like. This was difficult to read and write, but it was a major improvement over having everything hard-coded in the source code. And so the TermCap library that could parse these descriptions of terminals and use them to know how to do the things that the visual mode needed in a way that was device independent. This was very important and popular. In 2BSD, the X executable got a hard link called VI, and if you called it as VI, then it would start up directly into visual mode. And in 1979, the maintenance of VI was handed over to a new hacker, Marianne Horton, and that'll come in important later. By 1980, the fourth BSD distribution shipped, and it included a library called Curses. So Ken Arnold took the screen redrawing code, basically lifted it right out of VI, and wrapped it up into a nice library wrapper so that you could write an application that described what you wanted a character cell graphics display to look like, and Curses would take care of implementing the minimum number of cursor movements and redraws and things like that necessary to update the screen to look like what you just asked it to look like. And now you can build really fancy stuff. So Rogue is the canonical Curses application. Here's a picture of Rogue, and it's not actually the first Curses application. In fact, at the first Roguelike celebration, Ken was here, and in a panel, he told us that he was writing some applications for his own use, like to display which of his friends were logged in, things like that. And that those were the first Curses applications, but Rogue was certainly like the killer app. So we're getting to the end of this period of video display terminals, and we're getting to the time when we get to workstations, microcomputers with bitmap graphics displays, and modern open source. So in the very early 80s, Bell Labs was doing really advanced stuff. Here's a picture of their Blit graphical terminal for Unix. Didn't have any local disk. It ran a tiny OS from ROM, and it could actually download more executable code over the serial link from the Unix system it was connected to. This is very advanced, but it was stuck within Bell Labs. In summer 1982 at the Unix convention, Marianne Horton presented a paper called New Curses and Term Info, showing that the curses library had been re-implemented to be more optimized, easier to use, easier to read the code for, and the termcap library, which had some severe performance problems at startup and was hard to read the database for, had been also updated into a more performant library with a database that had human readable descriptions that got compiled into bytecode in order to be read in more rapidly at program startup. But those cool things happening in Bell Labs didn't filter out into the rest of the market. So in 1984, Bill Joy did an absolutely wonderful interview with, I believe, I don't remember the name of the magazine, pardon me for that, but said here, the fundamental tension in Unix that I think AT&T doesn't understand is that everyone is going to have a bitmap. AT&T had a bitmap, but clearly people weren't aware of that. So Research Unix continued to evolve, but it didn't really influence the market. What did influence the market was that people were starting to get into microcomputers. I mean, obviously the Windows logo here is a little too new for this era, but in 1986, NCSA Telnet came out for the Mac and PC. It had an internal IP stack because nobody had networking stack built into their operating system anymore, but you could use a DOS PC or you could use a Mac to access a Unix system, because back in 1983, 4.2 BSD added TCP/IP to Unix. And also around that same time period at MIT, a research Windows system called the W system got improved. And so since we increment names in order to indicate that we've improved something, X Windows was born in 1984. In 1987, the X Windows System version 11 was released under the MIT license, the famous open source license still in use today. And because of the openness of that license, it became immediately popular. So now we get into licensing concerns, microcomputers, and these things lead into the start of the modern open source movement. So in 1982, Pavel Curtis was sort of commissioned by Marianne to clone the New Curses library in a clean room way so that outside of Bell Labs, folks could appreciate the improvements to curses. In 1984, work began on the GNU project to make a free Unix clone that didn't have any licensing encumbrances from AT&T, Bell Labs. In 1986, 4.3 BSD came out, which was the last BSD release that had AT&T code and copyrights in it. So commercial Unix kind of rolled on through the 80s there. In 1991, we saw the very first release of the Linux kernel, and also 386 BSD, which was a BSD release that had all of the AT&T code removed, well, a lot of AT&T code removed from it. But P-curses kind of languished. The last maintenance release of P-curses was in 1986. But in 1993, it got picked up and re-released as N-curses. And this was the last we ever saw of the original Ken Arnold curses. 1993 was a big year there for open source because it was the year that we saw Slackware Linux come out and NetBSD. So starting there from the mid-90s, we had a lot of what turned into the modern open source movement. We had gotten away from the AT&T Research Unix and moved into a more, a time of paying more attention to whether licensing concerns were going to hurt our ability to publish software. So we're now about 50 years into VI, but I'm guessing that most of you that are here today know how to exit Vim. your Unix shell still talks to a teletype just like it did on the PTP-7 at Bell Labs in 1969. I love this Bill Joy quote here, because if 10 years is a long time for VI, 50 years is incredible. But it's because the ideas are advancing, but they're sticky. They influence the next generation of software and of applications that we can write. So Visual Studio Code is arguably more advanced than Vim, but it's still influenced by the fact that the ADM3s that were at UC Berkeley didn't have arrow keys. They had arrows printed on the H, J, K, and L keys, and you can still turn on the VI key bindings in Visual Studio Code, because the software that we're used to using influences what we want in the next generation of software. And so even when we advance ideas, they stick around. So thank you very much. I'm always happy to share things like this. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
We do. Thank you so much. That was an amazing history lesson. And it's very fun to watch in chat how many people have fond and less than fond memories of much of the technology that you're talking about.
Absolutely, me too. So do we have a couple of questions?
We do. We have one that's just a comment of how cool the Rainbow terminal is.
It's called Lolcat, and it's funny. I installed it last night, and it took 31 megabytes to do the install on my Ubuntu machine. It's a big Ruby thing. It pulls in a lot of libraries and whatever. So out of curiosity, I went and looked at how big the install sets for OpenBSD that like got me started on Unix on the old Mac that I had 20 years ago were, and they were about 20-ish megabytes. So this entire Unix system was smaller than the modern library, the modern program that I use to make the pretty pictures. But it's called Lolcat, and I highly recommend it.
All right, good to know. I think some people in the chat correctly called that out.
Okay.
One great question from Esther. I'd like to hear more about Unix and Unicode and why roguelikes are so strongly associated with the ASCII block when Unicode is quite old.
That's a really great question that I am not a real deep expert on this, but for a long time, Unix was very highly dependent on ASCII in particular, with ASCII being hard-coded and just assumed all throughout. And so through the 80s and 90s, any sort of non-ASCII text representation was a real struggle. So obviously, text representations were a real struggle at that time too. You've got 3 or 4 different competing standards for encoding Japanese. All of these things. And so during that time, the code was all very ad hoc. And so like if you wanted to be able to type in Chinese, Japanese, or Korean on like an X11 system, you really had to be a real expert to get this stuff to work at all. And I think that part of that is just that these things were developed in the United States by this like group of people who were, for the most part, all very similar to each other, and all speaking English to each other. And so when Unicode started getting developed, it was really slow to get uptake, in part because the software ecosystem that Unicode was trying to get into was such a mess. And my only slightly informed opinion on this, like as somebody who was learning Japanese around the turn of the century and like struggling with how to type it on computers in those days, is that there's a bit of everybody had either given up on it or fought so hard to get the existing bad implementations to work, that there was a lot of sunk cost involved there. And so my personal slightly informed opinion is that Unicode take-up was really delayed by the fact that everybody had either given up or had so much invested in what was already there that nobody wanted to switch. But the advantages are obvious. And so, given 20 extra years, now we have pretty decent Unicode support, everywhere, like in the terminals on my Ubuntu box that I'm talking to right now. But it took a long time, and I think it's mostly just because of trying to get rid of all the old bad software.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. One probably last quick question. Do you have a favorite old terminal?
Do I have a favorite old terminal? You know, I'm gonna say yeah. I am actually a big fan of the VT220. In part because of a mistake that I made that got me into being a sysadmin. So we had in school we had this computing club, and we had a bunch of old like cast off Unix workstations and junk like that. This was in like the late 90s, like 99. And so we had some Unix machines that were 10 years old at that time. And we had a Sun 3 server with, it had a serial console. And so it had a VT220 sitting on top of this rack mount server, sitting on a desk in a computer lab. And of course, the VT220 had horrible screen burn in because it was always sitting there at a login prompt. And I saw it and I felt bad for it, right? So I went up and I pushed the power button on the front of the VT220, and somebody ran over because I was like, this is just a serial connection. It's not going to care. And somebody ran over. Don't do that. Well, why not? Because it had like a 25-pin serial connection. So it had like the hang up line and dial tone detect, and all of those lines were all wired in. So if you powered off the terminal, the server baseband detected that and powered the server off too. So I turned off this terminal because I felt bad for it being screen burned in, and it shut down the server. There were only like 5 or 6 people logged into it. We powered it back up and checked the file systems and apologized. But like,
That's amazing.
that terminal kind of got me
story.
started where I am today.
Empathy for the terminal.
Yeah.
A good computer. Pat. Yes. Well, beautiful. Thank you so much, Tabitha. This was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
It's so great to see you. I'll be hanging around in the chat.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Okay. Well, wonderful times. And thank you all for your questions and taking part. We are now heading into our first unconferencing block, which you might wonder, what does that even mean? Let me explain it to you. Find in my notes. Here they are. So, how to unconference. We have an unconferencing lobby, unconferencing hall, which you can find on the map. And when you go there, there is a special note board where you can suggest unconferencing topics. The idea here is that we wanted to give that feeling of when between the talks, you go around into different parts of the conference area and you talk about things that are interesting. Maybe you hear someone talking about Caves of Cud and you're like, oh, I love Caves of Cud. And so you go over there and now you got a whole little circle of people talking about Caves of Cud. So the idea is that you go to that note wall, suggest something you want to talk about. Doesn't have to be something technical, but it can be. If you're like, I really want to talk about that Quantic Foundry stuff. I really want to talk about just how much I love Caves of Cud. I really want to talk about, the history of, old computer software. Whatever you're interested in, you think other people might like to talk about. Go check that out. You can also upvote the topics that you find particularly interesting. And in about 5 minutes from now, about 5 minutes from now, moderator, might be me, might be some of the other mods, are going to go through. We're going to take the top 6 topics from there and just do a shout out to assign those to the different unconferencing dungeon rooms, which are all accessible through there. They have a link to a Zoom meeting, so you can have some actual face-to-face or at least audio conversation, which is a nice way to have a compromise of some people prefer this type of text chat we're doing a lot of, but it's also nice to, get that chance to talk to each other. So get out of the theater, get out of here, go to the unconferencing room, suggest your topics, and hang out. This also can be time for you to check out the game showcase. You can check out, whatever you want. One note, if you didn't see it already, we fixed the embedding. Wonderful dev team doing hot fixes. So when you come back here for the next talk, you should be able to use the embedded chat and not have to do a pop-up, though it is up to you. So I'm going to sign off and be back when we have the next speaker. Please go enjoy the unconferencing and get up, have some water, stretch your legs. Take care. Hello, everyone. Welcome back after the break. Hope everyone had fun. I'm here just a little minute early, checking in on folks. Hope you enjoyed the unconferencing rooms. It was really encouraging to see so many great topics suggested. If there were any kind of questions about how that worked, ask other people in the space, ask moderators, have a great time, explore the space. I think it's really cool. The topics were really awesome. I ended up sitting in the lounge, sipping a cup of coffee because I was tired, which is also valid. But we're going to have more unconferencing time later and new topics and things like that. So make sure to spread out in the space and have a fun time. And yeah, let's get right back into it. Also, thank you to everyone who's been tweeting stuff with the Roguelike Celebration hashtag. I loved seeing the pancakes. Pancakes were absolutely beautiful. And yeah, offer any kind of tips and thoughts in the chat, and we love to hear it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Hello.
Hi there.
All right. So Andrew Aversa, developer of Tangledeep, traditional roguelike for PC and Nintendo Switch. Though he considers himself a full-time programmer and designer, his background is in music production and composition, where he made a career for over 10 years before pursuing a lifelong dream of making games, which I think is very interesting.
Thank you.
And also, yeah, Tangledeep, fantastic game. I'm sure that there are a lot of Tangledeep fans in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. Last time I was here was 2018 in person, of course, but pleasure to be back.
Yeah. All right. Take it away.
All right. So that introduction basically covered everything I want to say about myself, except for the fact that so this talk, which I intentionally named to be ever so slightly clickbaity, the end of permadeath. This is not going to be about Tangledeep at all. So if you're hoping to hear about just Tangledeep, unfortunately, it won't be that. But it will be about a topic that I care very much about. So the reactions that I was expecting when I made that title, I'm sure people were wondering what it would be about. So I want to give an outline of sort of what I'm hoping to cover and what I'm also not really covering. So this isn't a topic about is permadeath good or bad, because I think that is completely subjective and it's just not inside the scope of this. It's also not really about accessibility or difficulty. I talked about that actually in 2018 and sort of about balance and roguelikes and how that is a very unique challenge. And I also don't really want to get into the nature of what a roguelike is. For the sake of this talk, it's not super pertinent because I'm talking about a specific mechanic, even though that mechanic is core to many roguelikes. There are certainly games that use it that we would not consider roguelikes, and there are classic ones that don't rely on permadeath that we definitely do consider roguelikes. So what this is sort of an evaluation and a high-level view of how permadeath changes how we design games, developers, how players play the games, and how we shape their expectations, and how their expectations could either be met or how we could fail to meet them, and how it's a tricky thing, but we can see, and I'll go into some of the permadeath optional games, how they've done it, alternatives, and sort of how that all shakes out ultimately. So you might be thinking, for Lynn interpretation, wait a second, like you take out permadeath, it's not a roguelike anymore. But no, it really doesn't matter. This is something that people really want to talk about, even in our roguelikes. I frequent that subreddit quite a bit, and you can see I made this little collage just of different topics that I saw. People saying, I want to play roguelikes without permadeath. Is it necessary? Permadeath is bad. I hate permadeath. Is it wrong of me to hate permadeath? And I thought it was just sort of funny in the bottom right. I had a couple topics that came up. This save scumming, in defense of save scumming. So save scumming is sort of interesting because it's like, oh, your game doesn't have permadeath optional. Well, I'm going to make it optional. And it sort of speaks to what I'm talking about here, which is how players' expectations and how the options you present can have a big impact on the ultimate experience. So first, where is permadeath optional? What kind of games? And I was as surprised as maybe you might be looking at this, that there are actually quite a few games, both in the traditional canon and certainly new releases as well, where it's optional. Sometimes it's the default that there is actually no permadeath. In particular, Stone Shard was one that really caught my attention because that is a fairly major kind of newcomer, I guess, in terms of the age of roguelikes in general. Stone Shard is a game that has just absolutely blown up on Steam. It's made an enormous impact as an indie game for a game that permadeath is optional in. And I believe that it is currently not the default. I'm sure things could change. It's early access. Things are shifting around. But all these other games, they're from small to large, roguelites potentially, all have varying degrees. It ends up being a spectrum, which I'll get into. There's a spectrum of ways permadeath is optional and a spectrum of ways that is perceived by players. So I want to define this a little bit first. What do I mean by optional permadeath? So this was the best definition I could come up with. Any mode or option where the player is not necessarily doomed to lose all their progress upon dying. So the implications of this definition are that there could be situations where you do die permanently. It doesn't mean death is just like on or off and it's a binary. You could lose some of your progress, like maybe you lose all of your weapons or experience, but you keep your weapons or something in between. There could be some kind of a buffer, like a life system or saves or rewinds or checkpoints where it's permanent in the sense that that particular point in time is lost. It's a dead end, but you can go back to an earlier point. The point is that it doesn't mean there's no penalty. So when I talk about optional permadeath, it does not mean that there's no penalty. And it doesn't mean that the option is default or prominent or hidden. That is its own thing, which I'm about to get into, which is how this is presented, how we define the default experience of a game as developers is monumentally important and will drastically affect how the game is perceived. This is true not just for games, not just for options in games, but really just in general human psychology. This has been studied at great length by other people. A classic example is actually organ donation, which is a very serious topic, but they've looked at countries that have similar cultures and similar people, and they've looked at the rates of organ donation when it was opt-in. In other words, you are not an organ donor by default, and you have to specifically say, yes, I want to be one, versus opt-out. You're signed up by default, and you have to specifically say, no, I don't want that. And if all things were equal, and if people were 100% rational and the brains worked very differently, then those rates it shouldn't matter whether it's opt-in or opt-out if it's the same general population. But in fact, as you might guess, the opposite is true, and it has an enormous impact on how people behave. So simply by how we present these options, we're already setting the stage for how people might play a game. And this is before we even get into the implementation of these options, the difficulty of the game, the balance, forget all of that. We're just talking about the title screen and character creation. So I think there are a few ways that the permadeath option, whether it's something like a hardcore mode in Diablo that is on or off, or whether it's switching the number of lives you have, the way that can be displayed can be split up into a few different categories. So one is that there are no options at the very beginning. You start the game, and the only way to either enable or disable a permadeath mode is by using some sort of console or going into a settings menu accessible only after character creation. This is the strongest statement that we can make as a developer to say, this is the way you play our game. And anything else is that's not really the intended experience. A pre-selected toggle is like a big psychological nudge to somebody to say, well, here's the default. We're highlighting it. It's in big text. And there are other things on the screen, maybe at the same time or in a drop down. But again, it is a fairly big indicator that that's what you should be doing. You can also nestle, I guess that's the way I would put it, nestle the option where you have to go to a separate screen. Let's say character creation, there's like a little cog in the bottom left or bottom right corner, or a sub menu that you don't have to pass through. So you could put many options in there. Many games do. We'll get into some examples, but obviously that is significantly downplaying the importance of that option. And then hidden would be there basically isn't any option. The only way you can possibly access it is by editing game files, by save scumming, and that is the developer saying, no, you just cannot do this. And if you want to do it, like, to have at it, edit the code, edit the memory, whatever. And then finally, the most equitable option, I guess, to all of the different modes that you might be offering, such as a permadeath on or off, is an equal selection. So you show option A, B, C, either in a vertical list, horizontal list, and nothing is pre-highlighted. You have to like hover over what you want and click on it. So there, I mean, aside from like maybe your eye is drawn to the left or the center of the screen just because of the way the text was rendered, generally speaking, this will probably provide the most even results. So if people see 3 options in front of them and they're not highlighted in a particular way, then they'll probably evaluate them roughly evenly. So here are some examples. These are not all roguelikes or even RPGs, but this is just to illustrate the point. So both Wolfenstein and Doom, they have difficulties sort of laid out like this. So while they show everything on the screen at the same time, the way they label things obviously tells the player, okay, this is not the real mode. Don't play this. If you play this, like, you're weak. You know, we only just kind of threw that in there. The opposite, I didn't get a screenshot of this, but there are games that have something like normal mode, hard mode, story mode. And story mode is like literally the complete opposite of this screen here, where you're saying, well, we don't think any less of you for picking this mode. And if you pick it, it's because you want to focus on the story, not the difficulty, and that's fine. Celeste is an example of a game where this is a nestled menu. So they have a wonderful assist mode, wonderful options for players that are not interested in sort of the traditional mode. And in fact, this is like the ultimate permadeath off in a way. Not that the game has true permadeath, but you can literally just say you cannot die, invincibility. But in order to get to this menu, you have to pass through like essentially a warning screen that says, we're about to show you some options. We recommend you play the game as it is first, but if you want, here are your options. So they're not hidden, but it's definitely dissuading the player from picking these things. And then here's ADOM. And here, I think, is a fairly equitable presentation where somebody could look at standard mode and hard mode. Those are the first 2 things your eyes would be drawn to. And roguelike mode is not the one at the top. And if somebody doesn't want to play a harder experience, then having that labeling is beneficial. And it's also beneficial to people that do want that experience. So this is like a very equitable way of saying you can play it either way. It's fine. And also what I thought was interesting, I'm not sure if this was a bug or not, but I was watching a streamer play this as a recording, and he had picked standard mode, but then it started him in this. It said, this is the best mode to get accustomed to the game. And in the text there, it says, if you feel comfortable with it, you can progress to like classic mode, the real mode. So it's a developer statement, a literal statement written in text. So this is one way to communicate your intentions to the player and set their expectation for what you intend for them to be playing. So I keep talking about expectations. What does that actually mean? And this is where I get into these weird shapes. And basically what these are on the y-axis, we have the amount of time the player has put into the game in a single run. So from early game to late game, at the very top, you've beaten the game. And then the x-axis is the amount of content. Content, we can very broadly define it. Just options for characters, gear, monsters, layouts, maps. And so when you have permadeath, and that is the default mode, and this is what people expect, you are basically guaranteeing that early content is going to be seen over and over and over and over. You're making a promise to the player that you are going to die. And so we are going to make, as developers, a wide variety of content for you at the beginning of the game. We're going to give you different starting points, monster types, locations, maybe all sorts of interesting creation options in the character creator. And if we don't do that, if we don't hold up our side of the bargain, and you're coming in expecting a permadeath experience, and we give you the same 5 floors in the same layout, monsters, even if it's procedurally generated, if it ends up being just samey, people will get bored. They might even leave a negative review. That's bad. And it also has this side implication of the story. And it's saying, if you're going to be playing this early game repeatedly, then we can't really make an intrusive story. And when I say intrusive, I don't mean to downplay the existence of story in games in general. I mean to contrast it with like a JRPG style game, or even a traditional cinematic game where you start the game, there's a 5-minute sequence before you actually get to control your character. Obviously, if you're going to die a lot and see the beginning of the game a lot, even the most amazing opening and cinematic and setup is going to become very stale very quickly. So we're saying we can't really have a traditional sort of cinematic story approach. Without permadeath, we're kind of making the exact opposite promise. We're saying that you probably are not spending much time in the early game. Why would you? Because if your character is not going to die, or it's hard, or it's rare, you will be well past that. You're going to breeze past that, and you're going to be into the mid game. And in fact, there's a question of, are you guaranteed to reach the end game? If we think again to more traditional RPGs, aside from things where you could have such a vexing puzzle that you cannot proceed, people usually expect, like, yeah, I'm going to be able to beat the game. Maybe I have to grind, but yeah, I'll get to the end. And so that brings up player expectations of, well, the final boss better be good. There better be a lot of options at the end. Like, I want to gear up my character. I want to go to fight hidden bosses. In the case of a very loot-driven game, which many roguelikes are, and many roguelike derivatives, we might expect there to be some kind of gear treadmill. I know that's a little bit of a pejorative term, but just the sense of, like, I want to keep getting upgrades. And this is a problem that even very big games have to grapple with, is like, well, what do you do in the end game or even the post game? Story also is probably going to be a little bit more of an expectation. If you invest all this time and you explore a bigger and bigger world with all this interesting stuff, and there's no story or payoff, it might come off as a little weird. Even games that are not necessarily super story driven, example being the Diablo series, Diablo 3 was sort of maligned a little bit because the story didn't go the way a lot of people expected that it would. Diablo is not a default permadeath game, so it's something where you expect to see the full story, and if it doesn't deliver, it's like, well, I'm disappointed now. Can you design for both? Can you make something where it's just like an equal width? It's not a pyramid at all. It's just like a straight line. So this is possible. The thing is, we're all human. We have 24 hours in the day. We don't have big budgets. We're roguelike developers. So, of course, it's not really going to be possible to put maximum effort and time and money into every single stage of the game. We have to make some decisions and concessions. And it can make things harder when you're trying to balance and weigh both exactly equally. Something that may be perfectly acceptable in a non-permadeath mode, like, oh, this monster hits for half your HP. Okay, that might be fine, or in an invisible trap. Some people might say that is completely unfair. And as I was doing this, I had to cut some content here just because of the length of the talk. But if you look at reviews for many roguelikes, you will see sometimes people are like, this was very unfair. Like the way you die or tend to die, like, this is unfair. I didn't see this coming. I lost my progress and I'm mad, and I leave a negative review. Yes, they're salty, but the point is that depending on how the developer was thinking about this, were they thinking about it like, oh, they're not going to have permadeath on, and so it's not a big issue? We don't necessarily know, but the point is that if it doesn't align with what people are expecting, then it becomes a very tricky thing to do, a tricky line that you have to balance on. And so here are some examples of some reviews that I pulled of different roguelike games. These are traditional roguelikes. I'm not saying which one was which, but this is to show completely different expectations that people have. So the first one, the summary is that playing it without permadeath on is awesome. There's always new things to do. Permadeath on is fun until you realize that you have to go through this early game slog again to get back to where you were. So this is somebody that feels like this game did not meet their expectations when permadeath was on, but they loved it when permadeath was off. It's interesting. Maybe should permadeath have even been an option if the game was designed that way? Or maybe the design should have been adjusted. The next one, somebody was saying, there's this awesome end game, but why do I have to play 13 hours of the game to get to that part? So a similar complaint, basically saying that it was boring and they just wanted to get to sort of like the fun stuff. So maybe the fun stuff should have just been put at the beginning. Now here we have something that's the complete opposite. I honestly find the early game harder and more engaging, but the further you go, it's more just like patience and preparation. And so they're saying, well, I'd rather just spend all my time in the early game. So this is somebody that really would prefer a very straightforward permadeath experience. They want to see that and see that rich content at the beginning. And once again, going back to the opposite, if something's not fun and its only purpose is to reach the second part, why not remove it? And then finally, this was a paraphrase because I actually couldn't find exactly where I read this, but somebody was saying the first half is where all the fun happens. And by the end, my gear and my strategy always converges. It's basically saying that it got too thin and squeezed by the end. And it's an interesting thing there, because maybe if the game had been designed differently, or if they had presented their options differently, that player might have had a different expectation. If they had said, well, if they had adjusted the difficulty such that it's very, very, very unlikely you'll actually get to the end game, then that 1 in 50 times where you actually do, rather than feeling like, I'm so bored, like, okay, I'm just using the same strategy I always do, versus like, oh man, I made it to the end game. This is crazy. Like, I can't believe I'm here. That's two different experiences. So what are some of the alternatives? How are developers playing with this concept of permadeath on and off, and how does it sort of affect things? How does each one affect the player experience? So the most simple option, and I just gave some examples of each, it's not an exhaustive list, but having just a permadeath off option is sort of the simplest approach. Like, you die and then you lose some resources and that's it. Like, you will get to the end of the game. You can't permanently lose. So all of these games shown have this kind of option. Then there's a life system, which is an interesting compromise because it's giving you a buffer. You might have to adjust the way you play somewhat, but it gives the designer a lot more room to say, like, yes, we can do a few unfair things. We can sort of push the limits a little bit of what might be considered fair, but we can also open up new rewards. So maybe you're willing to do this incredibly risky thing to get a cool sword because you only die once doing it, but you don't want to necessarily do that every time you see a cool reward because you only have 5 lives or 6 or whatever. Also, the lives themselves can be cool rewards. Then you have like a wizard mode, which is basically just saying, look, we don't care. We're going to make it possible to do this and disable permadeath, but it's just like a cheat code. So whatever. Or the reverse, like you can turn it on, but it's saying, hey, we have no guarantee that this is going to be fun. Like, have at it. A save system is also another interesting compromise, sort of like lives, because like with a classic computer RPG, like Western RPG or JRPG, you might have the option of saving anytime, or you might have only the option of saving at checkpoints, like inns or literal like rotating save points. But this is not necessarily easier than permadeath off or lives, because you could potentially save the game in a situation where you cannot recover. So you could be deep in a dungeon and you have no scrolls of return or whatever, and you save your game and you don't have enough healing items, and that save file can be potentially doomed. And this may actually be more frustrating depending on how you design your game and the exit and return options, because if the player feels like it's an impossible puzzle, it's like walking into a room and the door locks behind you and you're just going to like starve to death kind of thing, where it's not fun. It's not a fun and heroic and valiant way of dying. It's just like, oh, well, I guess I have to start a new file then. But it does have other benefits as well, which is that it's somewhere between having literally no permadeath and having it as the default thing that just always happens when you die. So basically, in conclusion, people have very strong feelings about permadeath. Even people that are roguelike fans posting on roguelike forums and subreddits, like, these are fans, right? But they are still interested in exploring options. But the thing is, how we present those options is going to really affect their expectations when they play the game. Also, a problem for developers is that these sort of rules or modes of play can actually cause us to completely allocate our resources differently. So we have to very carefully think about where we're going to put our development time, our content. I know a lot of roguelike developers feel like content is almost the least fun part. Like we like messing around with map generators and procedural conversations and all this fun stuff. And then content is like, just, do that later. So we have to really think about that. But also that there's a lot of different ways that can be implemented that can feel just as difficult. And in some cases, again, can actually doom the player without literally having you're dead, files erased immediately. And we should also think, I guess, this is if I had to say one point, is that as developers, we should think about why we are including permadeath in our game. And if we're willing to fulfill the promise that permadeath is sort of stating to the player. Are you ready to promise that early game is going to be fun, that you're not going to have a story that's going to be too heavy for the beginning, that you're going to have enough variation in character creation? If you're thinking to yourself, I want to make this RPG and I want to have fighting dragons on a neutron star, that's like the experience I want to promise, you might want to think about maybe permadeath should not be the default, because you want people to get to that point of epic cosmic battles sooner rather than later. So thus ends the talk. Happy to take any questions. Thank you for watching and having me back. And of course, you can always email me at the address up there on the screen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have to say that the chat was popping off.
Oh boy.
It's certainly a interesting topic. People have a lot of opinions about permadeath and a lot of different comparisons from other games. So your clickbait strategy.
Clickbait, what do you call that?
Yeah, it worked very well. There's a lot of feelings, but a lot of good ones in terms of comparing different games. So the first ranked question is, how do you feel about meta progression and how it relates to permadeath?
Oh, well, so that is one. I talked about that a little bit in my talk 2 years ago. That's why I didn't really want to retread it too much, but
right.
I guess
go back and watch that talk is the answer.
Sure. But I will say just very, very briefly that is another way of sort of bridging the gap a little bit between the two options. If you want to say like, I really, really want to balance around just permadeath in terms of like the feeling of danger, but I don't want to scare off the people that are might be discouraged by dying so often, having such a difficult experience. And I think that there's definitely a lot of implementations of meta progress as well that can make people either feel frustrated, like I have to die to build up my character, versus, oh, this is cool. Meta progress, I get like more options. Like, wow, now I'm actually kind of like excited. Even if I die, I get to pick another starting location. Cool. So it can go either way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question that's more like an idea to get your thoughts of from R. Brady is, what do you think about user choice at death of, is this the end of your story? At that point, giving a choice to the user.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. I'd have to think about that a little more. I actually don't have a reaction right away. Yeah.
Throw a design problem at you live on stage.
Yeah, no, that's one that I don't think I can give an immediate reaction to.
Well, I guess people can try and email you and find you later to get your thoughts.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more.
We probably have time for one more question from Darren Gray. Some people talk about this as perma-failure or permanent consequence instead of permadeath, making it no different from board games where mistakes matter. Any thoughts on this framing?
Permanent
consequence.
Right, permanent consequence. Yeah, I guess I think it's definitely like an expectation thing, right? It's just like what you're saying, the framing expectations. It's two sides of the same coin. So if you're presenting something as like, yes, you have to, you might die a lot, but you're going to gain experience as a player, and this is part of the experience. So the consequences are relatively unimportant for any single run. That's okay. Also, I think the length of the play session can also change a little bit, both the framing from the developer and the player. If your average run is like 10 to 15 hours versus more of a coffee break roguelike, that's definitely going to change the way people feel when they get spiked for like 80% of their health later in the game. And board games are certainly on the very short end of that spectrum.
Though arguably permanent consequence in something like Monopoly is part of why that game is Terrible to play. Hot take.
Also true. Yep.
Yeah. Interesting.
Sure.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much. There's some other questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time for because, yes, very topic that brings about a lot of conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And hopefully
Absolutely.
people can try and find you and have some more discussion about that later.
Yes, I would love to. All right.
Yeah. All right. Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Yep.
All right. Excellent. Welcome, Tyreek, our
Yo.
next speaker and the lovely creator of our Roguelike Celebration shirts.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, so everyone should get those as
Yep,
well as
I'm
enjoying you being here.
Pretty pleased with how they turned out.
I'm very happy. They're colorful and everything. So, Tyreek, a game developer who's been working on the roguelike platformer Catacomb Kids for 10 or 6 years, depending on how you count. He's also worked on several games as an artist and animator, including Thor DS, Epic Mickey, Power of Illusion, and Cadence of Hyrule, which is very cool. And has created a couple of roguelikes for 7-Day Roguelike that he's pretty chuffed with, HVNTRS and Aftha in Absurdia. I had to practice pronouncing that one, I will admit.
Yeah.
So
Doesn't really roll off the tongue.
No, it's a little tricky. Take it away.
All right, so I am Tyreek. Imminently, I am going to be talking about multiplayer mechanics in traditional roguelikes and my endeavors to create a turn-based roguelike experience with cooperative gameplay in mind. A little background first, which was already covered a little bit, but I'm Tyreek, makeup pixel artist, game designer, fan of rogue paradigms, and I'm also a fan of the things that I make, which is why I make them. These are my current rogue credentials: Catacomb Kids, Hunters, Agatha in Absurdia, and Clean Sweep. I'm going to be talking about these two: Hunters, which I made for 7-Day Roguelike in 2018, and Clean Sweep, which I've been working on for the past few months, specifically as a sort of proof of concept for this talk. They're both multiplayer roguelikes that employ different methods of handling turn-basedness and player interactivity. In a bit, I'll talk about how I approached each and the things that I learned along the way. But first, before we get to any of my own personal endeavors, let's take a step back and examine the landscape of existing roguelikery that has led me down this path of years-long fascination. So, roguelikes. We know what they are. We celebrate them on occasion. They've been defined and explored multiple times at this very event. And nowadays, there are a great many kinds of roguelikes, with as many settings and styles as one can imagine. But for all of their variety, from the beginning, roguelikes have been primarily focused on the single-player experience, which is kind of a curious thing to me, given the era and inspirations behind many of the staple games of the genre. Rogue, as with many early fantasy games, took much inspiration from Dungeons and Dragons and other pen and paper RPGs, trying to capture the feeling of going on an adventure that's different every time and letting you craft your own hero, but without having the onerous requirement of needing another human to act as judge and mediator between the player and the game's systems. But a large part of those very inspirations, pen and paper RPGs, Tolkien-esque fantasies, etc., have a strong framework or theme of cooperation, camaraderie, friendship, and teamwork. Or alternatively, they provide for stories of intrigue, betrayal, and the pitfalls of human relationships. But they all have the element of humans interacting with each other in ways that reflect their individuality and unique abilities in the context of a group. There are plenty of exceptions, of course, but a lot of times a single individual delving alone into treacherous death traps and achieving godlike power through the acquisition of relics and ancient knowledge is like a supervillain. Heroes generally have friends, and heroes also don't generally lust for godlike power. This teamwork aspect of the fantasy genres managed to make its way into other computer games that were seeded from the same inspirations, like JRPGs with their 4-character adventuring parties that eventually became a convention of the entire genre. Or first-person dungeon crawls like Wizardry, where you create and control several characters as you plumb the dungeon's depths. Of course, these games aren't multiplayer per se, but they found ways to retain their source inspirations aspects of teamwork and parties of adventurers. But roguelikes don't seem to have retained the presence of teamwork as a theme in any lasting way, which I think is a shame. The dynamics of a team working together to overcome challenges that no individual could tackle on their own is extremely compelling, both narratively and mechanically. And given the nature of traditional roguelikes and their ability to generate stories through gameplay, I feel like party-based roguelikery is an underexplored space just yearning to be more thoroughly investigated. But I'm not here to just talk about party-based roguelikery. I'm here to talk about multiplayer roguelikery. Not just a fellowship of AI companions or multi-unit control, but a coalition of actual human minds exploring together the procedural spaces and systematic unkindnesses of traditional roguelikes. Why is this specifically something worth striving for? Well, I think the first and most obvious reason to explore multiplayer roguelikes is to generate more stories, more fun. Not just tales of yet another stupid death, but yet another stupid party wipe, or yet another ascension post wherein we had to leave behind our companion as they bravely defended a choke point from pursuing forces of evil as we barely escaped. Multiplayer can provide for stories of betrayal as your archer companion steals a vital potion from you to halt their petrification and leaving you to your fate at the claws of a basilisk. Stories of revenge as you manage to survive your plight against the basilisk in spite of their betrayal and hunt them down to exact justice. And of course, stories of hilarious tragedy as you both end up cornered and outnumbered when your revenge goes sideways and you both go down in a blaze of irony. Jim Shepard of Dungeon Mans did a talk at Roguelike Celebration in 2019 about simulating relationships in roguelikes, which I thought was very cool and compelling. But maybe you could save yourself a lot of code if you just replaced that simulation with an actual human. Another benefit is that it can help ease people who are new to the genre in if they have a companion to accompany them in their adventures. Imagine if rather than relying on wiki pages and YouTube videos to tell you what the best strategies are or how to navigate an arcane UI, you had someone that could fight alongside you and come to your aid when you managed to get yourself into a tight spot, or teach you the mechanics of a game in a much more hands-on, example-oriented fashion. Something that I learned from adding co-op to my game Catacomb Kids is that people are much more tolerant of failure and difficulty if they have someone to fail along with them. And they're much more inclined to keep trying if they have a companion to guide them through early frustrations. Lastly, I think that in addition to the above points, multiplayer in roguelikes has a specific advantage over AI-based allies and parties, which is that it allows for the full gamut of the complexities of the game's systems to be engaged with in a meaningful way by each party member. The complexities allowed for by human engagement go beyond just social interactions. With multiple humans behind multiple characters, you can really dig into the meat of certain systems in ways that would be kind of inconceivable with just AI-based allies, or cumbersome and time-consuming to execute with only a single player controlling multiple units. So think of all the buck wild character builds available for, an example, Caves of Cud, a perfectly rational, level-headed game. And now imagine another character as complex, as intelligently built, and as sentiently operated to support and synergize with said buck-wild character. The countless possibilities become even countlesser. More countlessful. So these are the sorts of things that I want and aspire to achieve through exploring multiplayer roguelike spaces. But before I get to my own attempts to achieve these desires, I definitely want to acknowledge that there are precedents for multiplayer in traditional roguelikes. The earliest attempts I'm aware of are Mangband and its child TomeNet, the latter of which is actually what got me thinking about this whole topic in the first place when I stumbled across it years and years ago. Mangband, as you might infer from the name, is an online multiplayer adaptation of Angband, and TomeNet is a derivation of it. Both games approach the task from a sort of MMO-style angle where players pick a server to join and can interact with anyone else on that server. And both games make concessions to the turn-based nature of their roguelike antecedents, though, by being somewhat real-time. But to alleviate the burden of doing quick mental acrobatics to assess and react to situations with the shift to real-time, the games let you assign input macros that can execute strings of commands at the press of a button. And indeed, I do believe these macros are probably invaluable at higher levels of the game. The depth and complexity of the games is not diminished at all relative to their contemporaries. Mangband and TomeNet are well and truly old-school roguelikes up to and including binding a different function to damn near every key on the keyboard. Both games are still very available and playable, and as far as I can tell, at least somewhat active. There's also Dungeon of the Rogue Daemon by Leif Bloomquist, who is going to be actually talking right after me. This vision of multiplayer roguelikery is almost the polar opposite of Mangband and Tomenet's. Very stripped down from much of the complexities, very easy to jump into. I won't talk about it much, but because it seems like it might be redundant, seeing as how the next talk is going to be all about it. But I think it's pretty neat and look forward to hearing about it from the man himself. And I just wanted to bring it up and acknowledge that it exists. So there we have the hopes, the dreams, and the context. Now, at last, we get to me. What have I done? What have I learned in doing so? And for what do I hope? The games I've mentioned so far, Mangband, Tomenut, Dungeon of Rogue Daemon, they're all online and allow for potentially large groups of players to be interacting at once, coming and going as they please. But my desire for multiplayer roguelikery harkens much closer to the idea of a small party of adventurers who trek through thick and thin together, their fates intertwined. Also, I don't know how to netcode stuff. All of that is to say that my endeavors are first and foremost focused on the local multiplayer experiences of 2 to 4 players and a single screen. So with that said, let's talk about Hunters. Hunters, or Hunters, either one works, is a cooperative roguelike for up to 4 players that I made for the 7-day roguelike jam in 2018. The title is an acronym that stands for Hellbeast and Vampire Neutralization and Tactical Removal Squad. The premise of the game is that you and up to 3 of your friends are members of a squad of vampire hunters tasked with eliminating giant hellbeasts after the world has been taken over by forces of evil in a medieval-ish demon apocalypse. My initial goal with the game was to simulate a sort of monster hunting party traveling through the lair of a huge dangerous beast and fighting it through cleverness rather than direct confrontation. That isn't exactly what I ended up making, but I'm extremely pleased with how it turned out regardless. And of all the game jams I've ever done, this is probably the one that I'm most eager to revisit someday and turn into a full-fledged game. So how does it work? Well, it was important for me that 3 things be true for the game going in. 1, you should be able to take your time on deciding on a course of action, as with traditional roguelikes. I most specifically didn't want there to be any turn timers or real-time elements that put any pressure on players beyond just making the best choice they can. And 2, turns shouldn't make other players wait for ages. This might seem kind of contradictory to 1, but what it essentially means is that I wanted to limit the decision space enough to the point that determining your possible courses of action could be done quickly, and once an action is decided upon, it should be easy to input and execute. And lastly, multiplayer should matter. I didn't want this to be a game where you could just be a single player who happens to have other single players around. I wanted to encourage teamwork and collaborative strategizing and risk-taking on behalf of others. So how did I attain these goals? Through queued actions, streamlined gameplay, and several overlapping layers of player interactivity that make it hard to ignore one another. So to handle turns, I wanted something that wouldn't be obtrusive, but would still allow for the space to think things through when necessary. And what I came up with is having each player input their action to queue it up for execution, and as soon as every player has decided on their action, the turn resolves. It's pretty straightforward. It's very easy to understand, and because of that, it's very easy to coordinate your actions with others. And the fact that it's easy to coordinate with others is actually a really important part of what makes it work so well for keeping turns short. Allowing players an easy means to coordinate with each other helps keep everyone engaged even when they've already decided on their own course of action. And for particularly complicated situations, having multiple brains mull over the best way forward really helps narrow down one's options and speed things along. Of course, this way of handling turns isn't without its drawbacks. For one thing, turn order does still matter and it can be difficult to suss out the result of certain actions, like 2 players trying to move into the same tile at the same time, or does a player move before or after being shield bashed and shoved by another player. It helps to have clear and consistent rules for how these sorts of interactions are resolved, or otherwise a means of checking which players have action priority over others. And that is to say, who is going to act first in any situation. Also, while basically unnoticeable in combat, having even a brief wait for all the queued inputs to register can get irritating in lower stakes situations like backtracking through an empty dungeon. And lastly, queued actions like this are reliant on the rest of the game being designed in a streamlined enough way to maintain the flow of the game for everyone. You don't want to get bogged down, for example, by one player needing to allocate skills while everyone sits around, or having to navigate several layers of menus in order to equip a weapon. Which brings me to my next point. Having hunters be streamlined and straightforward was important for me for a number of reasons, both to support the aforementioned turn queue system in a way that would keep it from getting burdensome, and to make the game easy to grasp and welcoming to new players, which is, I think, pretty important for a multiplayer game. To this end, the combat is deterministic with no dice rolls or chance involved. The enemies have simple AIs that behave in consistent, predictable ways. Inventory is kept to just 3 items, and inventory management is just a matter of pressing the button you want to assign an item to. And no action in the game is further than 2 button presses away at any given time. You never have to navigate a menu or even really read anything at all. And all you ever need to know in order to assess a situation is to just look at the screen and see what's happening. There's no hidden information anywhere. Lastly, there are the mechanics by which I hope to encourage teamwork and collaboration, like being able to hurt each other, which at first might seem like the sort of thing that would discourage teamwork, but my goal with including it was to encourage players to communicate with each other so they don't end up accidentally offing one another. Several of the melee weapons in the game strike multiple tiles, like the axe and the spear, and if you're standing in the wrong place or not telegraphing your intentions properly, it can be easy to find yourself on the receiving end of a blow in addition to the intended target. I will definitely concede, though, that friendly fire might actually just suck in practice, especially in a game that's already pretty dang tough in a genre that's known for being tough. It might be a little bit overkill. But it's in the game, and my intentions were noble, so let's just say a lesson was learned. More actually helpful to the end of encouraging teamwork are probably items that beget setup and payoff. These are the items that enable players to think ahead and act in ways that as a solo adventure would probably be of limited use, but as a member of a team become invaluable tools. Things that let you manipulate the positions of enemies and allies, and actions that you normally wouldn't want to take, but become really, really interesting and unique when used in the context of team play. There's a lot of fun possibilities here, and I feel like Hunters barely scratches the surface, but I feel like it's a space that's really worth exploring. Hunters also features a sort of bleed out timer that lets you revive your allies if you get to them quick enough. Saving them requires you spend several turns in a row standing next to them, though, which can result in some tense moments as you try to hold your ground next to them for long enough to bring them back. So that's Hunters, streamlined 4-player co-op roguelike. Like I said, I'm very pleased with how it turned out, and I'm eager to revisit it and make it something great. But before we get ahead of ourselves, there is another more recent endeavor that I've been chewing on that's a bit more unconventional. For me, at least, it was just as educational. Clean Sweep is an experiment I've been working on since late June based on a thought I had years ago about how to handle multiplayer in roguelikes. In it, you play as an elite squad of cleaning agents who are tasked with eliminating all the nasties on each floor and reducing the grime to an acceptable level. My goals for Clean Sweep were much the same as they were for Hunters, which is to say no time-limited turns or real-time actions, but also it shouldn't make other players wait forever, but also the multiplayer needs to matter. But also, I had the additional goal of trying to ease back in some of the complexities found in larger scope roguelikes, or at least to allow for the possibility of them. This time, I didn't want to shy away from the idea of having a larger inventory or more involved interactions and situations that require a bit more scrutiny. So I dug up this thought I had from years ago. What if creatures only cared about the turns of the player most relevant to them? There's a cat. I'm sorry if you can hear that. And that's how I came up with the parallel asynchronous schedule. I'm going to call it that because it sounds fancy and I'm allowed to make fancy turns up and you can't stop me. But the basic premise is that for the most part, creatures don't need to care about whose turn it is on a global scale. Sorry. Just whose turn it is on the most relevant scale. And the most relevant turn is usually that of the nearest or most threatening player. So creatures can get away with not moving when just any player moves, but only advancing their turn when the player most relevant to them moves. The end result of this is a system wherein creatures only act when the player most relevant to them acts. Of course, the interesting and challenging aspect of this is determining what it means for a player to be most relevant. But if you can manage to suss out the intricacies of that, the result should be a system wherein enemies each align themselves to a specific player's turn schedule, and each player can take their turn essentially whenever they want to, with no time pressure and without slowing down the game for other players. So that's the idea. Parallel, because creatures are operating on essentially separate turn schedules while still existing in the same space. Asynchronous, because players don't have to move in any kind of unity and can take as much or as little time as they want with a situation. And schedule, because that's the word for organizing units of time. So that's what I did in Clean Sweep. And it worked pretty great. You can see in this clip that there are two cleaning agents, wandering around, facing off against different groups of enemies, managing their inventory, all without infringing upon the other's ability to act or causing a turn to advance at the inopportune time, or having to wait for anything, or having to rush anything, which is exactly what the goal was. Each enemy, after spotting a player, syncs itself so that it only moves in time with that player's actions. It works really well for when the players are far from one another or separated by walls, but that's not really a huge surprise. The question is what happens when players aren't so far apart. Well, the matter of which player is most relevant in that case becomes a lot fuzzier, but we can establish clear guidelines to decide. First, and most obviously, is who can I see? If you break line of sight for long enough, the creature will stop targeting you and free itself up to... Oh. Sorry. Oh, wow. Sorry. I just got the comment. Oops. Anyway, sorry. Here we go. Line of sight. If you break line of sight for long enough, the creature will stop targeting you and free itself up to wander and target someone else. And whenever a creature isn't actively targeting someone, it becomes unsynced and moves when any player acts. Proximity, who is closest to me. If a player steps into a space immediately adjacent to a creature, they instantly become its target. And otherwise, the closer a player is, the more likely it is to draw the monster's attention away from whoever it's currently targeting. Threat, a player that attacks a monster instantly becomes its target. And lastly, activity. Which player that I can see and is within a certain range has taken a number of actions greater than that of my current target. That's a really complicated way to say, if one player is sitting still for ages while another is nearby moving around and using items and doing stuff, go after the player that's actually doing stuff. And that's about it for the rules that determine which player the AI chooses to target. There are a couple minor exceptions and details here and there just to tweak the feel of things, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. And here's an example of those rules in play. You can see that the enemies target first the player that comes within their visual range, and then the most active player. And if either player steps right next to a monster, that monster turns their attention and attacks them. So does the idea that you can essentially take some free actions near certain enemies as long as they're targeting someone else, or force enemies to change targets as long as you know the rules for how they focus their attention, seem exploitable? Probably it is, but it really depends on the kind of game you're making. And if you're using the system, then it follows that you'd be designing your game around the possibility of such exploits. Maybe instead of calling them exploits, you could call them tactics. I don't know if you'd be able to just drop this system into an already established roguelike, though, and expect great results, though I wouldn't mind seeing someone try it. But the promise to me is more in the potential and in this, and for further exploration down the road. So that's parallel asynchronous schedule, but that's not all that's going on in Clean Sweep. Like I said, I've been working on it for the past few months, and it's become kind of a dumping ground for all of my experimental roguelike ideas. For instance, in addition to the parallel schedule, you can modify any action so that instead of happening instantly, it is queued up to be executed simultaneously with the next player who takes an action. So I basically stuffed Hunter's system into this one. This lets you do cool stuff like get an attack bonus if you and another player strike an enemy at the same time, or get a speed boost if another player pushes you in the same direction that you're already moving. Or if you queue up an action and stand still, you'll catch any item that another player throws at you, which is a much more fun and time-efficient way of swapping items than dropping them on the ground for someone else to grab or having to sidle up to each other and trade things via a menu. There was actually a very cool moment when I was playing with a friend where I was surrounded by enemies and very near to death, and he tossed me a healing item, and I used it and made a glorious comeback, and it was just like, hooray, teamwork. It was such a small thing, but it felt good to experience the kind of scenario that I designed this game with the hope of seeing. There's also like Splatoon-inspired territory control where you have to like clean up the level as you go, and monsters can dirty it up again. And you're graded at the end of each floor based on how clean you made it. There's a bunch of stuff going on. So far, I've been talking about multiplayer in the context of cooperation and friendly party-based dungeon delving. But there also exists the potential in roguelikes for less friendly multiplayer interactions. And strap in, because this isn't going where you think it's going. So I mentioned that Clean Sweep has been kind of a dumping ground for all of my roguelike ideas, and that includes an idea that I had originally hoped to be the foundation of my 7-day roguelike entry this year, but very quickly abandoned. It never really got out of my head, though, so when I got to making Clean Sweep, I figured, why don't I just try and stuff it in here? And that idea was Twitch chat interactions, which is still technically a form of multiplayer. I first got this idea from Joshua Skelton of Delver renown, who quite a while ago streamed work on a Twitch chat-controlled roguelike-ish arena, where players could join and input commands like north, 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 east, north, north to control little characters by queuing up a string of directional movements that then executed over several turns. Well, I love that idea, and I was like, I'm just going to steal that. The initial thought was, hey, if I'm working on multiplayer stuff, I wonder if there's a way to expand that to include people beyond just the small party of characters, but without necessarily betraying the idea of the small party being a main focus. And then it was, hey, there's a whole website full of crowdsourceable antagonists who have proven willing and able to engage in games with surprisingly complex and skillful ways with extremely limited input methods, called Twitch. So now you can join Clean Sweep from Twitch chat and possess a monster and give it commands like go to Large West Cavern or chase player 2. And I'm not going to actually go into a whole lot of depth on the specifics of the Twitch integration, because I think that it's actually the least fun part and probably the biggest failure of the game. But I did want to bring it up because I learned a few things from it, and I feel like there's still some promise there if somebody else wants to explore it in the future. The main things I have to say about the Twitch experiment are these. Firstly, visuals are way more important when you have random people popping into chat with no idea what they're looking at and are not well versed in the visual language of traditional roguelikes. Even more so than was my goal with Hunters, having people be able to quickly and easily parse a scenario through visual information alone becomes extremely important. Secondly, being able to give the chat and player different views of the game would probably be most ideal. It's hard for chat-controlled characters to do smart things to surprise the player if they either can't see themselves or are always in view of the player. I wish I could have given the chat players a more holistic view of the game so that they could use their human brains to the fullest and set up scenarios unbeknownst to the player. And lastly, the minimum viable fun might not be very minimal. Chat-controlled creatures need to be able to do interesting and useful things, and more interesting and useful things than just chasing and hurting the player. But to my mind, that means having a lot of systems in place for them to play with from the get-go. The promise of this idea is that monsters can have actual minds behind them, but what good is an actual mind behind a monster if the only actions available to them are make the player's HP go down? I feel like for this to be an interesting and worthwhile thing to pursue, there needs to be more at stake than just the player's end, and a number of ways to make that happen. So there you have it. That's the things I have to say about multiplayer roguelikes. I don't know if there will ever be a standard system for handling multiplayer in roguelikes, or if there will ever be enough multiplayer roguelikes to warrant a standard system, but I do hope that this talk has at least encouraged others to prod at the edges of our assumptions and see what sorts of ridiculous new stories we can make with roguelikes and friends together.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Tyreek. People are very excited. Lots of ideas. I think someone mentioned that their brain was throbbing.
Oh boy. I don't know if I think you should see a doctor. That doesn't sound healthy.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have a ton of questions, but only 1 minute, so probably can't actually dig into them. So I think that probably the only question inside of here we actually have time to answer is, what is your cat's name?
My cat's name, well, the one that was meowing is actually named Jesus, but my cat's name is Pixel.
Okay, multiple
And
cats.
there's also a Scotty running around somewhere.
Gosh, you can't show us. Can you show us any of the cats?
I don't see any.
Yeah.
I don't see any within 30 seconds of reach of me right now. So
sad. So sad. Everyone loves the cats, though.
Yes.
Standard of all online communication. But I'm gonna take a screenshot of all of these great questions, and hopefully people can try and find you in a room later. Maybe let people hang out at the bar or something like that. Because excellent. Tons of questions. Wish we had more time, but it was just so packed full of information. So thank you very much for joining us. And
thank you.
Hopefully people find you in the space. All right. Hello, Lee.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you. And
Can
we're moving right along. This is Leaf, Bloomkist, retro gamer and hacker, wearer of wonderful hats. It makes me so happy to see your hat. You have it every year, and it's a mainstay of Roguelike Celebration. I feel like I'm there in person to get to see the wonderful hat once more. His passion is exploring the intersection of old and new technology, how it reinvents classic genres into multiplayer experiences. A great follow-up to our last talk. And you're going to tell us about Dungeons of the Rogue Daemon?
That's right. Daemon.
All right.
It's a little in-joke for the Unix programmers in the room.
I love the male Daemon in NetHack, so.
Great. All right. We have screen and we have video. So, hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. I'm in Toronto, so it's currently 3:30. My name is Leaf Bloomquist. I presented at the Roguelike Celebration a couple of years, so I'm going to keep today's talk short. It's really just an update on where the game has gone in the last year or so, and also an invitation for everyone who's watching to play and fool around. It's a little bit of a stress test for the server too. But I was thinking the forum would be in the game rather than me blathering. I'm also not going to get as philosophical as Tyreek, so thank you very much for the. I agree with everything you said, and your game looks amazing. And so thanks for setting the stage for multiplayer roguelikes. My approach has been a little different. He mentioned that my game was stripped down. So the reason my game, Dungeon of the Rogue Daemon, is stripped down is because it was designed to run on a Commodore 64 from the 1980s. Oh, can everyone see that? All right. So I went through this last year, but for folks who are new or who might not be familiar with the Commodore 64, you might be thinking, why? Why are you doing this? So first of all, the Commodore 64 was the best-selling computer of all time. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, they sold 17 million, although unofficially, the number is expected to be around 20 million, just because not everyone returned their warranty cards and things like that. It was a huge game platform. Any child of the 80s either had a Commodore 64 or knew somebody that had a Commodore 64, and there were 25,000 games available for it. So it was primarily a gaming platform, but it was also open to a lot of hacking and productivity. And many of those were roguelikes. So there's a strong history there. The C64 is fun to program on. It's bare metal machine language, and it's very well documented after 30-some years of reverse engineering. There's a very active community. There's thousands of users worldwide, and people are into gaming, collecting, developing, hardware hacking, and so on. I'll talk a little bit about some new hardware coming up. But especially in the last 10 years, the community has created networking hardware. You could now hook your Commodore 64 up to the internet. Why would you do that? Well, partly because you can, but this also opens a lot of doors for multiplayer. So the multiplayer experience, I grew up in, I spent my formative years playing multiplayer games in the same room, playing with friends, playing competitive and cooperative games. And part of my goal here was to recapture that feeling, except with, the online element. Because us Commodore 64 fans are fairly spread around a little bit. But this new networking hardware, gives you so many opportunities for new games and reinventing new games, which is something I think is pretty cool. So I've been messing around with different genres for multiplayer, and a couple of years ago I thought I'm going to tackle a roguelike. So this is repeating some of what Tyreek said, but this is my input on it. So you're wandering around in the dungeon, but you see other characters. And what if those other characters were other players? So you can interact with them. You can go on quests together with them. You can team up against monsters. Work together to solve puzzles. And leave each other tools, clues, and share equipment. I think that would be pretty cool. I've also taken a slightly different approach from Tyreek in that there's no specific strategy or anything. I think of it as a sandbox. I've created the game, a set of rules, drop players into it, and see what happens. We saw what happened when I launched the game. I did a little live demo at Rogue Celebration last year, and something like 50 people joined the game. And the first part of the game is you have to find a key and unlock the door. But with 50 people in the way, we had to let the guy with the key through, and there was a lot of pushing and shoving, and they were passing the key along. And finally, we got the door open when I had 10 seconds left in my talk. It was one of the funnest experiences ever. But I've also added a couple of different gameplay mechanics to kind of engage that. Tyreek said make multiplayer necessary. So here, I haven't taken a very heavy hand to that, but there's a couple of instances where I'm just kind of nudging the players to work together. So the way the inventory system works in my game is you can carry an item in your left hand or your right hand. And that's so you could double up swords or double up shields or one of each. That's up to you. And there's also other things to find. I won't give everything away, but there's potions and keys and gold and so on. But there's no inventory. If you need to carry a sword and a shield and a magic item and the key that unlocks a very important room towards the end of the game, how can you do that? Well, get some friends and get them together and share it. So that's how inventory is handled. Again, it encourages multiplayer. Get a team together. And I want to eventually introduce puzzles where you have to be at the right place at the right time when something happens. That's all developing, and Tyreek gave me some really great ideas. When you run across an item, you can inspect it to see what it is or use it, which enables its function. Though oddly enough, not everybody seems to have a Commodore 64 at home that they can hook up to the internet. Fancy that. So I was thinking, well, I also re-implemented it on a couple of different platforms to make it accessible to everybody. But one design element one goal I had right from the beginning was this is all going to be a shared world. So no matter whether you're playing on a Commodore 64 or on a modern web browser or on your phone or Telnet, from an old or you found some weird mainframe at a vintage computer festival that you've also managed to hook up to the internet. I want these platforms to all be able to play together, and so they can interact, and you get the essence of each platform, but still a unique and fair game between them all. So this has been kind of fun. I've had some success with this. I've got the Commodore, the web browser, Telnet interfaces working. Other retro platforms can use Telnet. The mobile interface is still a little sketchy, but it's getting there. See, it's all written in JavaScript, which I've been teaching myself the last few months. And I see folks are starting to log into the server, which is great. So a quick update on what's new since last year. I named the game. That was actually the hardest part. Programming, no problem. Took me a year and a half to think of a name. You can now choose your own avatar, so your character can be a little more customized. There's 4 to choose from. I might expand those. I've added many new items and monster types. And for the super nerds in the audience, there is now something called the Ultimate 64, which is a Commodore 64 re-implemented in an FPGA. An FPGA is a field programmable gate array, which is a revolutionary new type of chip that can be reconfigured to be anything. You want it to be a Pentium? Done. You want it to be a Commodore? Done. You want it to be a whatever? Done. So someone by the name of Gideon has a company called Gideon's Logic, has launched a brand new Commodore 64, all done with this FPGA technology. You can also hook it up to the internet, so I had to spend a bit of time putting that in. And again, the mobile version, not perfect yet. A couple things I have left to address. I want to improve the mobile interface. I want to add ranged weapons. I want to improve the monster AI. It's a little sketchy, but they're still a challenge. And I want to make the dungeon much larger. It might get a little crowded in there today, but we'll see how it goes. And of course, procedurally generated. Of course, because this is a multiplayer shared instance, this would be procedurally generated, at the beginning, when the server is instantiated, and then everyone would enter that procedurally generated dungeon. Here's how you can reach me. I'll be hanging around all of the various Roguelike Celebration rooms. I'll be wandering through the rooms. I'm on Discord. But here's my email address, Twitter handle, finding me on Facebook. I even have a blog that I haven't touched in a long time. So please reach out with any comments and suggestions you've got for the game. And a couple of quick credits, because I've got 1 minute left. Thanks to everyone who wrote the actual networking code, my playtesters. The graphics were done by a mysterious entity, calls himself QOW. And of course, the organizers of Roguelike, who I just reached out of the blue a couple of years ago, said, hey, I made this crazy game. Can I come check it out? And I've discovered this amazing community of like-minded folks, which is fantastic. So enough talking. Let's play. So there is a web interface for the game. You go to rogue.jammingsignal.com/rogue. For the diehards, you can telnet and get to the address there, and that gives you the full ASCII experience. And just so everybody knows, the game is winnable. I have put a goal at the end of the game, and you have to determine the magic word. I'm just going to show, I'm running short on time, but I'm going to give everybody a quick look. Let's stop screen. There we go. And share screen, Chrome tab. All right, can everybody see that? Or any of the moderators, let me know if this is not visible. This is little, very simple hand-coded HTML thing to get it started. And here's where you can download clients for all the different retro machines and setup instructions. I've also got a Discord voice chat and a text chat so that you can chat along with the other players. For the really keeners, there's developer forums. Please join and give me some suggestions. All right, let's run through it. So demo. Using my avatar. And wow, see, there's tons of people. I tried to get into the game a little earlier and get down to the second level first, but the game timed out while I was talking. Because it's multiplayer, I had to have a timeout mechanism. So if you don't touch a command for 5 minutes, it boots you out. So you can see it's more real time than turn-based. You could say it's turn-based, except the turns are 50 milliseconds. But there it is. So I'm going to be joining in the game and following the hordes down into the second level. I encourage everyone to explore and give me feedback. And let's hang out in the dungeon of the rogue daemon and have some fun and some adventure.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's funny. Some people have been here before and are excited to see it show up again. Some people, this is their first time. Definite suggestion of wanting wider hallways. But yeah, so everybody go ahead and have fun. We are now officially on our lunch break of the day. I guess I'll let you go, Leaf, but people can find you in this space and can find you inside of your own game. Hopefully people can send you the magic word, and we can maybe people can try and post it, and hopefully if we can keep track of it, the first person to actually find it, we can call them out. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for sharing again.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, so as I said, we've entered break time, and there are a few different things you can do. You can go stand up, have lunch, have something to eat. Time zone wise, it may or may not be food time, but it's always time for a snack. And get ready to come back later. We've got, of course, the game to play. We also have the game showcase area where you can play a bunch of different games from people. We have the unconferencing rooms. We're not doing official unconferencing right now, but you're free to use them anytime. One thing we do want to make sure to call out based on some things people have been saying, feel free to leave rooms at any time. You could just get up and walk out. This is a physical space. You're not signing up for anything in kind of permanent ways. Even the unconferencing rules. It's not anything formal. You're not signing a contract in blood. If you realize, hey, you want to go talk somewhere else for any reason, just leave. It's fine. And finally, we have had some people have problems with the chat where it stops seeing new messages. We're looking into that. If you see that there are no messages for a while, probably no one is talking because generally chat is pretty busy. So just refresh the page and that should fix it. We'll hopefully find a more permanent fix for that soon. So enjoy the space, take a break, remember to drink liquids of some kind that are good for you, and get up every now and then and have a lot of fun. You can check the schedule. We will be back for our lightning talks, which will be very fun, at 1:30 Pacific time. If you click the schedule, it should show in your time zone, which is excellent. And yeah, enjoy your breaks. Enjoy playing the game. I'm going to try and figure out what the magic word is. And I will see you all in a little under an hour.